Chapter 31.2 Fighting Monsters in a Mine, Part 2. How does it look? Ni good, laddie. Not good, boy, Dalrak answered Roland while hitting the collapsed passageway with a pickaxe that he grabbed from the ground. He was a dwarf, so he knew a bit about living underground and in caves. It's gonna take us at least a day to clear it or more. It's going to take us at least a day to clear this, or more. The tunnel that they came from was in shambles. Dalrak also mentioned that he was unsure how deep it had collapsed in there. They could very well have to spend days digging themselves out. This wasn't the biggest issue, though, as the real problem were the ant monsters that could come from any of the other tunnels that connected to this larger cavern. The area they were staying in had about 50 meters in diameter and 3 meters in height. There were 4 tunnels connecting to it, and they branched out into more. Some were dead ends, and some led to places like this one. They had 2 options, either digging themselves out in hopes that the passage that they previously took didn't collapse in any other section. The other one was going through the tunnels that connected to another exit. I don't like this. They never mentioned that this place suffered from earthquakes. Roland voiced his opinion while the rest of the party gathered. Everyone was on high alert. The elf was standing closer to one of the corridors and was listening for any approaching monsters. You think it was something else? Orson asked while kicking a rock that tumbled down the rocky cavern. It produced a small echo that traveled through the large open space. Not sure, could have been one of the other teams fighting the ant monsters under or above that corridor. He gave his opinion. Maybe the other teams were fighting strong foes and used some explosive magic to get away. Things like spell scrolls were common enough, and the party with Tier 2 adventurers could have had some Tier 3 ones with them. Aren't ants good at digging? Maybe they just dug under that tunnel? The half-gnome girl chimed in. This was also a possibility. That didn't explain the loud sound before the tunnel collapsed, though. Either way, we need to get out of this shithole, Orson proclaimed while removing some blood from his large sword. He was finally able to swing it around in this larger cave. No use staying here, as the mage said. We just need to follow the map to the exit. Hey, his name isn't Mage, it's Roland. Hells, I shouted out at Orson, who flinched a bit, but he quickly recovered while looking maddened. Roland was surprised by the girl's short outburst, but he just nodded at her as a thank you. The half-gnome was bashful about the gesture as she turned her head to the side, while blushing slightly. Whatever, the ants aren't posing a problem yet. We could try moving forward. There is also the possibility of them swarming us from all those tunnels, if we wait here, said Roland while the party continued to discuss the situation. Finally, they all agreed that waiting here and digging would probably not be the best option. The ants could endlessly continue swarming them from all directions if they stayed too long in one spot. They could also dig more tunnels and come from below or from above. Roland placed the map on the ground and looked at it along with Salinar and Helsai. The girl was eager to learn some map reading, and she was also interested in the conversation the two were having. Here, the collapsed tunnel that we came from is here. He had something akin to red crayon with him, as well as a pencil to scribble on the map. The closest exit should be here. He marked their destination on the map. By the length of the tunnels, he could tell that it would probably take some time to get there. He could probably take a break here at this junction that connects to more tunnels. It's about the same size as this cavern. The 2 warriors from the group didn't care much about what Roland and the 2 trackers were discussing. They stood to the side while keeping watch over them. Salinar nodded while looking at the path they were going to take. Hels, I just scratched her head a bit, as she wasn't really knowledgeable with reading maps or measuring the distance. This would be something she wanted to look up when she got back to the city. After witnessing these 2, she was slowly realizing what a good scout should be able to do. There wasn't much to pack up beside the ant antenna and the larger mana stones that the evolved version of the worker ants had. A monster that had gone through at least one evolution in their life would always possess a monster core. The more evolutions, the larger and denser they got. The size wasn't always an indicator of quality, as the mana stones could be rated similar to the runes, from lesser all the way to legendary. The mana orbs of light floated forward right above Dalrak's head as he entered the new corridor. The whole party ventured forward, but now they had to account for attacks from the back. This made Orson move to the backline to protect his squishy party members. They journeyed forward, slowly into the unknown. They didn't know if the other parties were okay, but the basic worker ants didn't pose much of a threat to any of them. The problems started when the acid-spitting ones came into play. It took about another half an hour for them to encounter another group. This one was also mixed, having the advanced variants sprinkled into the mix. Dalrak received a couple of acid shots with his shield, while Roland cast a defensive barrier around the party with an actual incantation this time. He had given up on grinding his skill at this point. He needed to save the one-time use scrolls for later. It was unknown how many of the ants there would be, and even having one more scroll could turn the tide towards their favor. The biggest downside in the strategy was that his party members had to contribute a lot more now. He had blasted through the ants with runic spell scrolls, but now he was conserving them by casting regular incantation-based spells that needed time to prepare. Dalrak ducked to the side. Aye laddie, mana blast. A large concentrated orb of mana traveled past the dwarf and connected with two acid-spitting ants. There was a small explosion that caused the two monsters to lose parts of their thorax. This left them incapacitated, but not dead. This was enough for the party's tank to plunge his halberd onto their heads. Mana Blast was the most powerful spell a newbie Tier 1 mage could muster up. It would be later replaced by the commonly used Fire Blast spell that packed quite a bit more punch while causing a massive explosion. If he was able to use that, he could probably have been able to kill those two in one shot. After clearing out about 10 of those ant-like monsters, they heard Orson's shouts from behind them. "There are some fuckers behind us." Everyone besides Dalrak turned around. The dwarf was still keeping the front protected. He couldn't let the party be overrun from both sides. Luckily, it was only a couple of the normal ones, so even Orson was able to take them out with the help of his sidearm. He had placed his two-handed sword onto his back for the time being, as it wasn't optimal for fighting in these tight corridors. "Fuck, I'm never taking another mission in a blasted mine or caves. You know that most adventurer jobs are in dungeons, right?" "Hells," I quickly replied while sighing. "Shut up." While Orson was complaining and spitting on the ant corpses, the sun elf from the party did something peculiar. He pulled out a bottle of some sort and started pouring its contents onto the dead ants that were behind them. Hart looked with interest, but their silent party member didn't look like he felt to explain his actions. The most interested person was Hels. I that in turn looked to Roland, wondering if he knew something. Before Roland answered, a peculiar smell invaded his nostrils. It was the smell of peppermint. It was severely times more intense than regular peppermint, which caused him to back away. He remembered something from his old life, which prompted him to voice himself out. "I think he's trying to cut off the monster ants' chemical trail. If it works, the ants that come here won't be able to follow after us." Roland looked to Cylinder, who nodded. He probably didn't have much of that oil and used it only now after ants were appearing from behind. He continued while stopping with the dissecting of the monster corpses. They did nab the mana stones that Roland was able to pick out, though. This saved them some time while also allowing them to get something for their troubles. The elf continued to spill the strong, smelling oil here and there in the hopes of masking their smell from the monsters. It seemed to be working, as no more ants appeared from the rear. They managed to get to a junction with more tunnels going in various directions. It looked to be clear on the inside, so they ventured forward while keeping vigilant of their surroundings. The time they had spent in this mine was reaching 5 hours. "Do you think they will send a rescue party, Hels?" I asked while looking at the magically lit cavern and the scattered minecarts. "Probably not, unless one of you is some kind of noble or rich merchant's son, that is," Roland commented while the guys laughed. To the half-gnome girl, this was new. She thought adventurers were a tight-knit group of excitement seekers. In reality, they were more or less mercenaries that wouldn't move unless a lot of money was on the line. Unless someone made a request to save them, no one would be coming. "If we hurry, we can reach the next exit in 2 or 3 hours. Hels, I was a bit saddened by the realization that no one gave a mole rat's ass about them. She could only steel her resolve and move forward. At least the guys that she was together with felt more genuine than her last party. Roland looked around. He could see that his team was getting tired. The tunnels were stuffy, and they had been wandering through them while fighting monsters. Still, it would be better to continue towards the exit as soon as possible. Resting in this cavern could be a death sentence if more ants appeared. "We need to follow that corridor." Roland pointed at the next one that they needed to use. They continued forward while Cylinder used up his oil behind them. If the adventurers knew beforehand what they were going against, ant monsters, they could have brought more of that oil that the elf was using now. They arrived at another larger cavern. This time around, they were greeted to a gruesome scene. "What is this?" "Hey, isn't that one of ours?" Orson called out while looking around. Here they saw many large ant monster bodies dead on the ground. There were a lot more than what they encountered, and besides them, there were also other bodies, the dead remains of 2 adventurers. They quickly assessed the situation. The other team must have gotten into a big scuffle and suffered casualties. All teams had at least 5 people with them, so the rest must have escaped. Chitrolin looked at the map, and then at where the corridor that led to the other exit was. It had collapsed and was blocked off. It was probably safe to assume that the other adventurers set off some kind of explosion while running away. Roland was beginning to think that he made a mistake in coming here. His skills were leveling up already, but things were also looking grim. The only thing good in this situation was the sheer amount of mana stones remaining in those insect corpses. There were even some of the larger-looking acid ants sprinkled into the mix. Maybe digging back the tunnel when they had the chance would have been the better option. "What are you doing?" Roland asked as he spotted Orson going through the dead adventurer's belongings. He even saw him nab his storage bag and attach it to his belt. "What? Not like a dead man needs this." The dead person looked like some kind of archer or scout by the light armor he was wearing. The other was a warrior. His long sword was to the side, embedded in an ant's body. Strange that those ants didn't drag those bodies away. They must have killed them all before escaping back and setting off the detonation, which would mean shit. Just as he expected, something showed up. The sound this creature was making was different from the other ants. Soon it appeared out of one of the corridors. Its large head barely fit through it. This ant was larger than a horse. Its head was something that stood out the most as it was quite gigantic. The mandibles were really big, and they looked like they could split an adult human in half in one bite. Mimic Soldier L53, P1001, 108, 1001, 146. Roland could somehow use his identification skill to see the monster's name and P counter. The moment he saw the numbers he frowned even more. There was a threshold monsters reached just like the other races. A monster would evolve just like a person. The first evolution was past the 25th level, and then the second past the 50th, which was similar to going through your first Tier 1 class. This monster was something that was on the level of a Tier 2. Its lower HP count indicated that it had suffered some damage before, but it looked that it regenerated most of it now. Watch out. Everyone took up a fighting position, 2 fighters in the front with the range attackers in the back. The elf was the first one to give of a shot, and his arrow traveled through the dimly lit cavern, hitting the monster on the head. To everyone's shock, the arrow just bounced away without leaving more than a scratch on the monster's hard exoskeleton. After the hit, the monster was alert to their position, and it gave out a high-pitched scream before charging forward. It was surprisingly fast for its size, and Dalrak would probably have a tough time blocking its approach. The robust dwarf wasn't willing to dodge though. He lowered his center of gravity and grabbed his shield with both hands. He put himself between his party and the monster like a proper defender. "Come to daddy, Hackett bugger. Come to daddy, you ugly bugger." The monster's large head slammed into Dalrak's heater shield. The shield buckled under the pressure, and the muscular dwarf was pushed back. His feet made a streak in the rocky ground below. The monster started biting with those large mandibles. The thick shield was unable to stop the massive pressure as it started giving out. Orson didn't wait for his party member to just die there. No, he mustered up all of his strength and brought his large two-handed sword down on the monster. It was a clean hit to one of its legs, which flew right off. He was sure to aim for the weak spot in the joints, and his aim was true. He tried swinging further, aiming at the more armored parts. The second swing was blocked by the exoskeleton that only showed a slight scratch. The monster abandoned the shield. Dalrak used this chance to back off. His hands and legs were shaking as he was barely able to take this evolved monster's charge head on. The ant turned its head towards the other warrior, maddened after losing one of its legs. It was still able to keep its balance thanks to the remaining 5. Its mandibles opened up again as it tried to bisect the attacker. Orson was too slow to react. He thought that he could at least topple the monster after taking out its leg. Luckily, a red bolt of fire magic landed on the ant monster's head before it could go in for the kill. The monster screamed in agony after receiving Roland's firebolt spell to the face. This was a common grade spell, which was in the Tier 2 ranking of spells. The monster's antenna, along with its eyes, started to melt. This was enough to cripple the monster's senses and making it more or less blind. It didn't stop there. Roland used another fire arrow spell and aimed for the head, yet again. This finally made the monster drop down. Dalrak went back into action and used this chance to swing his halberd down on the twitching monster. Orson followed right after as he brought his two-handed sword down in a similar fashion. The two continued, and Hels, I along with the elf also joined in. All of them finally stopped after the monster's legs finally stopped twitching. Everyone was sweating and panting after defeating the Tier 2 monster. They looked to their mage that surprisingly could use an advanced spell type. "I brought some spell scrolls," he explained himself, while the others nodded. Their conversation ended prematurely when they heard the ominous sound of insect feet coming their way. "I hope you brought marrow, we are after need time. I hope you brought more of those. We are going to need them." A drop of sweat ran down Roland's forehead. He did indeed bring more of those scrolls with him, but if he had enough of them to last through this entire mine expedition, wasn't something he was willing to bet his life on. For now, he gathered more mana into his hand while reciting an incantation. A blue sphere of mana formed in front of his right hand, while in his left, he was holding his binder-like magic book. This fight was only beginning. Chapter 32.3 Fighting Monsters in a Mine, Part 3. The party was in a large open cavern. After defeating the Mimic Soldier, they got quickly swarmed by multiple monster ants. There were all the 3 variations of the mimic monster ant that they already came across. The most dangerous were the soldiers that appeared. Luckily, the party had someone with enough firepower to keep them busy. Multiple large balls of water splashed onto the approaching ant monsters. Following them were similar spheres. They radiated a slightly different kind of elemental energy. A ball of frost flew towards one of those large mimic soldiers. The ant reacted by dodging to the side, but part of its large abdomen got hit. Instantly, the ant's body started freezing. The frost traveled upwards and caused the large monster to stop in its tracks. These monsters were insects and were also cold-blooded. They couldn't regulate their internal heat and relied on the environment. Some species developed specialized organs to combat this, but this monster ant certainly didn't. The moment its temperature dropped below a certain point, it would start acting sluggish, and finally, it would start to hibernate. Roland's party members watched as their mage used some kind of flimsy booklet. Each time a frost and water-related spell flew, a page would disintegrate into nothingness. After the initial frost appeared, Roland activated a wind elemental spell scroll, which caused the area in front of him to become even colder. He had successfully simulated a sort of blizzard spell, which was causing the monsters to become sluggish. Now, while they can't move attack, they noticed that the active ants had become quite slow after the area was covered in frost and ice. They were also feeling cold, but the adrenaline and their clothes kept them awake enough for them to continue with the fight. Orson and Dalrak engaged the monster in close quarters melee. They found it surprisingly easy to finish off the lethargic ants. Even Hels, I moved in with her dagger. Her weapon was continuously stabbed into one of the monster ants' head, causing it to promptly bleed out and die. Roland concentrated on the most powerful monsters from the group, which were the two soldier variants. The other spell that he used in combination with the ice ball spell was the whirlwind spell. It kicked up a storm, and together with the already chilly air, caused the monsters to halt in their tracks. For the finishing touches, he used gale arrows, as well as rock arrows, and focused them on the mimic soldiers' joints. Their exoskeleton was quite hard to crack even in their weakened state. When the monsters were damaged enough, the two warriors from the party could finish them off with their physical attacks. The battle continued, and Roland started going through his spell scrolls. His rune mastery skill started leveling up at a rapid pace. The monsters they were fighting were also tier 2, which caused everyone to level up quickly. Hels, I had already gained 5 whole levels since coming to this mine, and this battle was still ongoing. The battle didn't end quickly. The ant monsters kept coming and coming. It was as if there wasn't anyone besides this party left for the mimics to hunt. All of their focus was pulled here, but when they entered the freezing cavern, only death awaited them on the inside. While the party was continuing with their death bout, something else was happening outside the mine they were trapped in. Two people were seen arguing with one a lot angrier than the other. You gave us a false report, admit it. A man with a beard was holding a chubby man by the neck with one hand while shaking him about. Nonsense. How could I have known that it was a mimic infestation? The man being held up was the supervisor of this mine. The person holding him up was Wells, the man responsible for this expedition. His party was lucky enough to not have any tunnels collapse on them. They had ventured inside just like Roland did. After a couple of fights with the ant monsters, they also came across a soldier variant which they dispatched. After that point they had retreated. The probability of them dying multiplied, and they weren't willing to test their luck. We need to report this to the guild. This isn't a mission suited for steel-grade adventurers. He looked to the teams that had made it out. 3 from the 4 teams had returned, but one of them was missing 2 members while the 4th didn't come back at all. This was Roland's party that was still the only one remaining trapped inside. We need reinforcements from silver and gold ranks, maybe even a platinum. We have no idea if a queen is with them. Those are tier 3 monsters. We have no chance against that, and they become agitated if too many of her hatchlings die. Wells finally moved his hand away from the man's thick throat. The old man landed on his posterior before getting pulled away by some of his own bodyguards. Those couldn't really do anything as the person in front of them was a gold rank adventurer. Wells, those low ranks haven't come back, and it's already been several hours. We have to presume that they are dead. The party leader looked to the woman that came over. This was a silver-ranked adventurer that was his teammate. He gave a nod. The tunnels needed to be collapsed further as they couldn't let the ant monster infestation spread outside. Fine, do it. We will wait for reinforcements before finishing this mission. The guild shouldn't fine us anything for this. The woman nodded and went away. After a while an explosion was heard. Wells just looked with a frown on his face, as this was supposed to have been an easy mission, with maybe a few deaths from the more inexperienced adventurers. The explosions that just occurred were deliberate. The miners placed explosives further inside the mine shafts and blew them up. Everyone knew that the ants were able to burrow through hard rocks, but they still needed time to do it. After the reinforcements arrived, they could clear out the rubble and try again, this time with reinforcements. While this was happening, the team of 5 that was presumed dead was sitting down and resting. They had vanquished a large surge of monster ants. Now tired and depleted, they were resting and eating. The area around them was covered in frost, but thanks to some coal and magic they had managed to make a fire. Morale was low, but everyone was still alive. To the side, multiple dead cadavers of large ants were scattered everywhere. I've gone through more than half of my scrolls. Most of the spells I have left are the fire ones, Roland thought while biting into some bread and jerky that he had pulled out from his storage bag. Everyone besides Hels, I that lacked a spatial bag, had brought over some provisions with them. The half-gnome didn't go hungry. Food and water were shared with everyone. Will they leave us in here to die? The girl asked while slightly shivering. She was covered with scratches and dead ant blood. Like everyone here, she was tired and stressed. The others looked at her with a solemn expression on their faces. Aye, lassie, very likely. The girl, just like the rest of the party, had trouble understanding this dwarf, but they got the gist of it. They were on their own here. Roland already looked at the map and knew where the closest X it was, but his thoughts were interrupted by another tremor. This one was a bit larger than the rest, as the whole cavern shook for a moment. That came from Roland looked at the map again. Those sounds were coming from the direction of where the exit should be. Before he could voice his concerns, the Sun Elf spoke up. Cave in the tunnels, standard procedure. Seal of the nest, wait for specialized adventurers. Shitty fuckers, they couldn't have, Orson added while scrunching his forehead and kicking a dead ant body. We can't know for sure before we check the exit first, Roland said while scratching the back of his neck, his eyes glued to the map as he looked for other exits. He quickly marked spots that couldn't be reached anymore. He also placed an X mark on the tunnels from where most of the ants were coming out. This gave him the idea where the original breach should be. I think the ant's nest should be around the spot. He made sure to draw a big red circle around it. It would be better to avoid these parts of the cavern. The soldier ants could only be brought down by his spell scrolls, but if anything stronger showed up, they would be in deep trouble. Hope all these explosions won't flood the tunnels. Hells, I murmured to herself while trying to eat. This halted Roland's thinking process as he recalled that this mine was close to a large river. He recalled that the mining company sealed off the original entrance to the grotto that this mine was named after. Hellsai, you are a genius. I am? The girl was surprised at Roland's outburst. Everyone was being quiet while they rested and recovered their stamina. Yes, listen up. The other three male members moved their heads towards the young mage. They had already accepted that he wasn't your regular magic caster. If he wasn't here, they would have probably been killed by that giant soldier ant. They had even managed to get rid of multiple ones thanks to all of his spell-slinging capabilities. Remember how this mine is close by the river? Everyone nodded, unsure where he was going with it. The mine originally had its entrance through the grotto, but they sealed it off as it kept flooding the tunnels inside. He continued. The elf was the first one to realize what Roland had in mind. The other three were lagging a bit behind. How does that help us? Orson asked, his strengths laid in fighting and not really in making plans. Richt, I get it now, right, I get it now. Dalrak slapped his thigh as he finally realized what Roland meant. Hels, I and Orson strained their brain power, but none of them could figure it out by themselves. They looked at Roland to enlighten them. We just need to go to where the old tunnels were and blow them up. Those tunnels were just sealed off to keep the water out so the wall shouldn't be too thick. Aye, they likely plastered it up a wee bit, Dalrak agreed with the youth. The old tunnels were probably just patched up. The water didn't even reach that far, so they didn't even need to fully fill it up. There was also another thing. Ant monsters were known to stay clear of the water. The probability of them tunneling there was also lower. That's fine and all, but they are still sealed off. Are we going to use these mining tools to get through? The monsters might fin us through the vibrations in the soil. Dalrak nodded, bringing up that issue. If they started hitting the walls, the vibrations and loud noises could alert the monsters to their presence. Even though the tunnels were probably sealed lightly, they still would need a lot of time to get through them. We won't need to use them, leave that to me. We will blow the wall up. Roland smirked a bit while thinking of a certain scroll that he made. It wasn't really good as an attacking spell, but could be used as a bomb or explosive. You sure came prepared, Hels. I looked at the youth, feeling somewhat glad that he was here while also being dejected that she was so useless. If she ever got out of this place, she would probably take a safer approach to this adventure lifestyle and prepare more beforehand. Thought all mages were only good at talking big. This shrimp isn't half bad. Orson nodded while giving Roland a smack on the shoulder that sent the youth stumbling forward. He had been more or less accepted as the temporary team leader. The others didn't really mind that he was the youngest from them, as ability overrode age. I've recovered some mana, we should go. If what Cylinder said was true, there won't be a rescue party appearing anytime soon. The travel time here was about 2 days from Edelgard. If they blew up the entrance area just now and considered the time of gathering adventurers, no help would be arriving sooner than 3 days, but a more realistic time frame was probably a week. Everyone here was already tired and Roland's spell scrolls were reaching depletion. If another large swarm of ant monsters appeared, they would be in danger of getting wiped out. Heading towards the water was the best option, as it cut off the ants' chemical trails that they used to communicate with each other. They planned out their route and finally departed. Everyone was on edge, as they had spent quite a bit of time in these dark corridors. The only light came from Roland's spell, which sometimes flickered on and off. Everything was silent. They weren't coming across any other ants after having dealt with the large onslaught before. They didn't know if they'd just annihilated most of them and there wouldn't be any more coming, or if they were still getting chased. They increased their pace, going faster and faster as they tried to reach the sealed-off tunnels as fast as possible. They finally arrived. The area was another juncture with a wider open space. Abandoned minecarts and mining equipment was left everywhere, and even some ant tracks could be seen. Still, there were no monsters to be seen. They had somehow arrived here safely. Good, it should be around here. Roland looked to the elf and the dwarf. They would probably be better fitted to find the spot where the tunnels were sealed off. The two nodded, and it didn't take the duo long to find the unnaturally looking wall. Dalrak gave the rock a hit with his polearm and nodded. Tizar Orson looked at Hels, who also nodded. The two stood on guard while Roland prepared the explosives. The item that he pulled out didn't look anything like explosives though. It was a larger-looking scroll with a lot of runic symbols on them. Don't worry, it packs a punch. Roland moved over to the wall and looked at it, not really sure where to place the scroll. He asked Dalrak for some help. They took a thick nail from the ground and attached the scroll to the wall by hammering it in tightly. We should bring some of those mine carts over. When I activate, it'll blow within 5 seconds. The others could hide behind something. But he had to activate the scroll and then bolt to safety. The party set up some minecarts closer to the explosion area so that Roland could activate it and then run. Okay, here goes nothing. If this works, I'm not going to leave the whorehouse for at least a wee, Orson mumbled while going behind the mine cart, his words bringing a frown on Helsa's face. How about you give the dwarven girls a try? Dalrak laughed while thinking about the outside and the fresh air. Selenar just ignored the others, as always, and just continued to look at the surroundings with his bow out. His arrows were mostly depleted, but he still had a couple of shots left. Roland placed his hand on the larger scroll and activated it. He pumped some more of his mana into it, and then bolted for the minecarts. The spell scroll lit up, and the others could see the runic symbols glowing blue. The color then shifted to red before the whole parchment shone in a bright red light. Just as Roland vaulted over a cart, it exploded. Luckily, he got pulled down by his robe by Orson the moment the explosion occurred. The loud boom could be heard everywhere, even by the people outside. The party remained behind their hastily set up barrier and waited for the dust to settle before going out. To their dismay, the wall didn't fully go down and the path was still blocked. Is that water? Hels, I commented while Dalrak grabbed one of the pickaxes from the ground and quickly ran up to the blasted wall. He smacked it with the axe a couple of times and moved his head over. I can cop a breeze, we are almost through. Roland pulled out another one of those scrolls and everyone was excited. Judging by the spell scroll's previous display of power, it should be able to blast through this already loose wall. They set it up again and quickly got back into position, the thought of safety on their minds. They all watched as Roland moved back to the scroll and activated it again. They smiled a bit as they saw the kid hastily run back behind cover while his spell scroll activated. This time around he managed to get behind the carts in time before the explosion occurred. Another loud thump made the whole mine shake. We did it. Good work. Let's get the fuck out of here. MMH. Everyone rejoiced as the opening now looked large enough for them to fit through. Some water started pouring in, but it was at most up to their waist. They should be able to get through this. Before they could get up, another tremor made the whole mine quake. They all looked behind them and spotted a strange occurrence. The ground started rising upwards, and a huge ant head emerged from underneath. A monster that was several times bigger than a Miamek soldier started crawling out from the hard rocky ground. It was still an ant, but its abdomen was a lot longer than what you'd see on a normal ant. The monster filled out quite a bit of the cavern, and its head even hit the ceiling. It gave out a screeching scream the moment it spotted Roland's party that was still behind the mine carts. Mimic Queen 01, 163 Fucking hell, quickly run. They all bolted for the exit. There was no way that they were going to defeat that thing here. Roland brought out his binder with the rest of his spells and started pelting the monster with fire arrows. To no surprise, the fire spells didn't even leave a dent. He couldn't even burn off its antennae as he did with the soldier variant before. It's a tier 3 monster. He fired off a smoke arrow that caused some confusion before quickly turning around. He headed towards the created exit, the huge monster close in pursuit. He dived in while everyone else was already a bit further. His team members frantically pulled him inside. Everyone started running without looking back. The monster dived right in after them by slamming its giant head inside the tight corridor, gnashing with its huge mandibles at the adventurers while slowly forcing its large body inside. The whole corridor shook while they backed off with haste. The water inside slowed them down while the beast continued with its chase. Fuck, it's coming. Roland dove his hand into his spatial bag and pulled out something. It didn't look like a scroll. It seemed to be a hairless pelt with a lot of runes drawn on it. The monster was moving towards them faster than they were escaping. He decided to use his last lifeline, even though he knew the consequences. What are you doing? Hels, I shouted while looking back. She saw her mage team member hold a large pelt with one hand, while placing his other in the middle. The moment he did, the center part started lighting up. She could see mana traveling in 6 directions from the middle part and traveling in symmetrical directions upwards. It connected with some other runes, and then it traveled through even more glistering pathways. A bright flash of red light was created, and a massive amount of fire arrows shot out from the other end of the large piece of monster skin. Roland had scribed multiple fire arrow spells onto a monster pelt that was used as the main resource for scrolls. The multiple fire arrows combined midair and connected with the monster queen's large open mouth. The huge ant received a mouthful of fire energy and quickly backed off while giving off an incomprehensible wail of pain. Roland flew backward into the arms of his dwarven party member. The hand that he used to power his spell was all mangled and charred. All of his fingers were broken, and the burn marks reached past his forearm. His vision was hazy, and he passed out soon afterward. The shouts of his party members weren't reaching his ears as everything faded to black. Chapter 33. Returning to Edelgard. Huh? A man about the age of 25 opened up his eyes. He had fallen down from what seemed to be a gaming chair. He was in a small apartment that only had one room that connected to a tiny bathroom. The whole place looked messy and unkempt. What was I doing? He stood up, his eyes felt heavy. He felt as if he had been sleeping for days. Dazed and confused, he glanced around. The room around him seemed familiar yet distant at the same time. He looked around. The apartment was badly kept and dirty clothes that were rolled up into a ball were thrown in the corner. A half-eaten microwave pizza was to the side along with some soda. This drink had long lost its carbonated properties and now would taste like sugar water. The man rubbed his head as he sat back in his chair. He felt like he was forgetting something important. He remembered returning from a hard day's work while almost getting run over by a truck. Then he started playing some games. I must have fallen asleep while playing, he thought to himself while looking at his PC screen. Instead of seeing a game on it, he saw a pitch black monitor. He leaned forward to his mouse. Maybe his computer had gone into sleeping mode after he dozed off. The moment he jolted his mouse, the screen flickered and something appeared, something that didn't look like a game. What the? He saw an image of an ant. It looked awfully realistic and somehow more monstrous than a regular insect. The image on the screen looked at him as it moved. He moved his head to the left, and the large ant's head moved to face him. His first thought was that it was some kind of new gaming feature. Things like eye tracking weren't new. The strange part was that he wasn't wearing anything for the program to track his head movement. He didn't even have a webcam on his computer, and he wasn't wearing his VR headset either. While he was thinking, an odd occurrence took place. He saw that the ant's head started pushing through the large flat computer screen, as if it was trying to tear through it. He instantly jumped back in panic, falling down from his chair yet again. After some pushing, the monster ant's head finally burst through the 32-inch screen. The thing gave out a massive loud wail that caused all the windows in his apartment to shatter. He moved up his right hand to protect himself, but he spotted something wrong. He couldn't move it at all. The man looked to where his arm was and saw it mangled up. It looked as if he put it in a garbage disposal. His fingers were all bent out of shape, and the pain was unbearable. Before he could register this, the monster ant's head moved closer. Its giant mandibles opened up in front of his face, and they chomped down on his head. "No!" A youth in a black robe shot forward, his loud scream alerting the people next to him. "Hey, calm down." Roland's eyes went wide. He wasn't sure what was happening. His first instinct was to look to his right arm. He remembered activating the barely tested scroll that he made. It was a yet unreliable product that he supersized after making a smaller version. He used the whole pelt from a monster sheep that was used for regular spell scrolls along with some better magic ink. He created the runic spell by Jerry, rigging as many fire arrow runes onto the pelt as possible. He managed to connect them all together with the magical pathways, and fixed it all up with his debugging skill. What was created was a haphazard runic spell scroll that overloaded when you tried casting it. The backlash from activating it was the reason his arm almost exploded. At least that was what he thought had happened, but for some reason, his arm looked mostly fine now. His fingers weren't disfigured or gone, and the burn scars were faint. He looked to the side and finally realized that he was in a moving carriage. His party members were sitting there and looking at him. "Why th girly," screamed he, "get there, laddie." Dalrak the dwarf laughed out loud while Orson sniggered on the side. "Hells." I looked at the two men with narrowed eyes and even gave Orson a shove. The young man just sniggered further. "Hey, stop making fun of him, he almost died." Roland's face showed lines forming between the eyebrows while he tilted his head to the side. "Hells." I looked to him with a slight smile on her face as she explained what happened after he had used that spell scroll of his. "After you passed out the Mimic Queen, apparently, the spell worked, and the Queen Ant backed away into the mine. Due to its size, the tunnel collapsed right after the monster retreated. Roland had passed out. Orson carried him to safety over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes. The adventurers outside were already waiting for them. The two explosions that they caused to blow up the wall alerted them to their presence. Wells, the expedition leader, was really surprised to see them there all alive with only Roland being injured. He was then healed by the Tier 2 priest that had tagged along on this expedition. The priest had advanced healing miracles which allowed Roland's fingers to be patched up. The reason that they were in a carriage now was that they were heading back to Edelgard. So the expedition leader ordered a retreat after realizing that there was a Tier 3 Mimic Queen in the mine. In short, yes. Hells, I nodded while relying on the information. This made sense, as the Tier 2 team would probably have a hard time against a Tier 3 monster. To bring down a monster at that level, they would probably need a full party of equally strong Tier 3 classes. Monsters tended to be stronger than their human counterparts, and the gap widened on the higher tiers. "Well done back there, laddie. Couldn't he have made it back, would you?" Dalrak said, while giving Roland a manly smack to the back. This caused the youth to almost face-plant into the wooden carriage floor. He was slowly getting fed up with these people smacking his back all the time. "Yeah, great job, kid. What was up with that spell anyway?" Orson asked while everyone stared. Roland had made quite an impression on the adventurers here. Some of them were even thinking that he was a Tier 2 in disguise. "Ah, it was just a spell scroll I bought. It's not like I can cast those myself." From the standpoint of these adventurers, this had to mean that Roland was someone rich. There was no way a normal person would have so many common grade spell scrolls on him of various elemental affinities. He had to either have some kind of connections, or be the son of a rich merchant, maybe even a noble in disguise. They would of course not pry into his business, but it was something they would remember. "Hey, if you need advice on some of the shops in the Flower District, come find me in the guild. I can introduce you to all the best girls. They'll take care of you. Just say that Big Brother Orson sent you." Roland had a blank look on his face while he was listening to Orson talking about the Flower District. This was how the city's red light district was called. The warrior was probably thinking that he was giving the youth some sound big brotherly advice. The young boy, that was actually a person over 30, wasn't as appreciative. He could only shake his head while Orson talked about his passion. The dwarf even started butting in. He tried to sell Roland on the dwarf girls yet again. These two were quite the pervy duo apparently, and they seemed to be hitting it off together. "That's why men are hells." I had a big frown on her face as she listened to these idiots talking about the red light district. They were even giving the youth some insider knowledge with her right next to them. She did find it odd that Roland wasn't interested at all. He wasn't even blushing, as a normal kid his age should be. Roland just ignored the horny duo and thought back to what transpired today. He had gotten himself trapped in a closed mine, and even the people in his expedition were working against him. If they didn't blow up the exits, he might have been able to get out of there without a mangled hand. He believed that the Queen Ant wouldn't have noticed them if they weren't blowing up the wall to the closed-off mine shafts. Somehow he managed to survive still. He had to rely on others to get to safety just like before. If he was alone, he would have probably died in that passage, if not by the Queen's hand then by the rubble. He had prepared more this time still. It was not enough. He underestimated the danger yet again, and had almost suffered the consequences. Roland knew that there wasn't enough data, like the monster type or where they were specifically located. Halcyon's team on the other hand did the right thing and stayed clear from this one. He would have to take things more seriously or quit being an adventurer whatsoever. This was a failure in his eyes, with only one good thing coming out of it, which was his runic mastery skill level. There were so many ants there and he had used up most of his runic spell scrolls. He didn't need to kill monsters to level up his runic mastery. Hitting them was enough. He was looking at a maxed out basic rune mastery. He had killed some Tier 2 monsters, and also landed a devastating blow on the Mimic Queen with his unconventional scroll. This was apparently enough to level this Tier 1 class skill up really fast. He wasn't the only one from the party that had gained a lot from this expedition. Everyone had multiple mana stones in their possessions, and they killed a lot of monsters, which allowed them to get a lot of experience. Hells, I had the biggest jump in levels, from a measly Tier 1 level 10 all the way up to level 23. She would be soon allowed to get another Tier 1 class and join the Steel Adventurer ranks. Roland had gained 2 levels throughout the whole encounter. He might have even maxed out his class if it wasn't a crafting profession. The rune mastery skill it had was unconventional for the type of class it was. He was banking on it, unlocking better job options in the future, them not necessarily being other Tier 1 classes. "Thanks for pulling me out." Roland spoke out towards his party members who were arguing about women's busts again. He at least had to thank them for getting him out of there. He wouldn't have been able to survive otherwise. The guys laughed a bit. The elf remained in his spot as he just kept looking outside the carriage. "Hells," I blushed slightly, unused to getting thanked by others. They returned to Edelgard in one piece. The journey back always seemed faster, and he also was out cold for half of it. They wouldn't be needing to make any kind of reports to the guild as Wells was responsible for that. They had to pull back due to the misreport that the mine manager gave them so they wouldn't suffer any fees for an incomplete job. If they would be getting all of the rewards from the mine owner was unknown, they might have to walk away without getting paid anything. This wasn't something Roland cared that much for though. His main profession was a crafter. He had gained some mana stones that he could sell. He also gained a lot of experience and could now evaluate where his strengths and weaknesses lay. For one, this large pelt scroll that he came up with needed some protective measures. Maybe if he attached a barrier spell to cover his body during its activation, it could mitigate the damage he would potentially receive to his hand. He also realized how limited this style of combat was. If they didn't find an exit and had to wait there, his scrolls would run out eventually. He would have to rely on his regular spells that were much weaker or his own close range fighting capabilities. He might have to train his combat skills up. Most of them were stagnant after he got used to his backline support position. This and a few other things needed adjusting. He hopped out from the carriage and stretched out his sore body. He was still surprised about the power of healing. His arm felt brand new, and he could vaguely tell where the burn mark started. A healer could cast this spell, which would normally cost you quite the penny if you bought a common grade recovery potion. Well, I will be seeing ye around. Dalrak packed up all of his gear and said his goodbyes. Been interesting, you bastards. Hey, wait up, dwarf. He and Orson had apparently bonded over booze and women on the trip here. Maybe they would be forming a party of their own soon. Farewell, if destiny wills it. Our paths will cross again. Cylinder said his one-liner and then walked away, his long golden hair dancing in the wind as he strutted away without looking back, his bow over his shoulder. The only ones remaining now were Roland and Helsai. They were quite the odd bunch, Roland muttered out while Helsai nodded. And you're not odd at all? Me? What's odd about me? The girl just rolled her eyes and moved forward. She wanted to go to the guild and sell the mana stones she gathered. After Orson took that dead adventurer's spatial bag, everyone agreed on giving it to Helsai as she lacked her own. She was now richer and could probably afford better armor and better weapons for her next adventure. What? Roland raised his eyebrow as the girl didn't answer and just started walking away. After a while, she just turned around and started waving, a smile plastered all over her face. See you later, Mage Roland. If you're ever in need of a scout, you can come find me at the guild. Yeah, see you around. Roland just nodded. He wasn't sure if he would ever meet the girl in the future. After working as an adventurer, she seemed to not be as bipolar as before. She still sometimes had some angry outbursts, but it was mostly focused on Orson that liked to butt heads with her. He himself went back to his lodgings. He had ditched the old room and found himself something bigger. His bed and mattress were now half decent, and he left most of his work-related stuff back at the store. He laid out the contents of his spatial bag on the table. There were various sizes of mana stones there. Ones the size of fingernails, and larger, at the size of a marble. The larger ones belonged to the Tier 2 soldier type, while the lower ones to the workers. He wasn't sure if he wanted to sell these yet. Supposedly things like magic ink that he used for the scrolls was somehow also manufactured with these as a resource. Some weapons even used these stones as a power source that could be later recharged. He was going to be fashioning weapons like that in the future, so not selling these would probably save him some money in the long run. Roland glanced at his status screen. He only needed to get a couple of levels, and he would be able to switch to his third Tier 1 class. There was another path he could take, getting a Tier 2 class instead, which would give him the 1.5x multiplier to his stats, and would make him a lot stronger than before. He wondered how fast other people got to those Tier 2 classes, and if it was worth not to gain more levels with the Tier 1 classes instead. His future progress might be stunted if he didn't unlock more skills. 3 levels shouldn't take more than a couple of months of scroll crafting. He nodded to himself. He already spent a lot of time crafting scrolls. This would put him at a year into his contract. There was a bit of a problem he was afraid of. When he switched to a blacksmith class, he would need to drop one of his class bonuses. He might have to give up the bonuses his scribe class provided. It gave him bonuses to mana regeneration, and it lowered his mana consumption while crafting scrolls. He had a large pool of mana as it was, but he burned through it quite fast when crafting. His mage class also gave him more mana as well as mana regeneration, which was best for crafting. He would have to see. This was something that he would tackle on a later occasion. He had gone through quite the adventure, and he was really tired. The carriage wasn't a place that he could sleep, and he mostly remained awake for the rest of the journey home. He still had some days off, and he would use them to sleep it off. After he recovered, he would grind till the next class change and finally get his blacksmith class. Chapter 34. Time to become a blacksmith. Edelgard was a large city. It was considered prosperous in the kingdom, and was renowned for its crafting professions. A lot of the country's magical equipment was manufactured right here. An item with a quality seal coming from here was most of the time guaranteed to sell and bring in coins. These coins were being regulated by the merchant council as well as by the noble house that was here. The nobles mostly kept their noses out of the merchant business and only required them to pay taxes. This was natural, as most of the aristocrats were busy with other things, like attending parties, acquiring merits, and gaining favor with people in a higher position like the duke houses or the royal family. In a well-lit room, there were 6 people sitting around a round table. 2 chairs were empty, but this didn't stop them from speaking. This was a gathering of the rich merchants that were the largest business owners in the city. Some had others deal with things like this by sending proxies. One of those people was the gnome manager that Roland was affiliated with. Blasted mine cost me a fortune. How did a Miemek infestation spread there? This makes no sense. A large dwarf with a bit of a tummy to him was slamming his large hand on the table. This hand had various golden rings on it just as his beard did. Just some bad luck, Tilda replied, an elven woman whose skin color was dark. She was a moon elf. She had a cigarette holder in her right hand, and some pink smoke was coming out of the end of the bud. She was squeezed into a black dress that showed quite a lot of cleavage. She looked to be a young beauty, but her age was several times above this dwarf. "I'm up, Lil Ada." "Shut up, Lil Ada," the angry dwarf replied while spitting out saliva in rage. "You should watch that temper, mister. Thard, maybe I should reserve a night with one of my girls for you. I'll be sure to give you a good price, Tilda." The woman smirked while leaning over to show off some more of that cleavage. The dwarf clicked with his tongue and leaned back in his chair as he started to calm down. "This doesn't make no sense. You know that those monsters don't wander near places close to water. Ma minds he's a large river next to it. Someone missed he lured time there." The dwarf voiced his concerns. The mine was far too close to a large body of water. The ants should have reacted to the moisture in the ground and invaded the area like the plague. "Yes, this does feel fish." The one answering was the gnome manager that Roland was working for. "Haven't strange things been happening lately?" The people quieted down and started mumbling. The mine disaster that caused the big headache for this dwarf wasn't the only thing that was out of place. "Yes, my convoys have been getting attacked lately, more than usually. I even had to pay out of hand for more bodyguards," another member of the council answered. "Someone put poison in one of the dishes in my restaurant when one of the nobles was visiting. They almost tore down the whole place." Another person that owned a lot of food-related businesses voiced his concerns. There had been a lot of irregularities happening in this city since half a year ago. The mine incident was the most high-profile one as it left a big body count, and the Adventurer Guild even had to get involved. "Someone trying to muscle and own or turf? Possibly, but who would be so shameless? We have the backing of the noble families, could it be?" The gnome stopped talking as he looked at the council members. It was possible that one of them was doing this. Even if one of their businesses was hit, it could easily have been a distraction. They started bleeding money. Someone could very easily just move in and buy them out for close to nothing. Even in his stores that he had spread through the city were getting hit, mostly by people complaining about the items failing and asking for returns. This in turn tarnished the store's good name and brought fewer customers that went to others to do their purchases. It wasn't that bad at the moment but could become a problem if it continued. Council discussed some more rumors, but they didn't come to any consensus. Everyone soon dispersed, and they just agreed to keep an eye out for potential spies and sabotage. They could easily have the authorities work for them if they found out who was messing with their businesses. The gnome manager was now sitting in a carriage with his elf attendant Ziliana. The gnome continued speculating about the real mastermind behind this. After some time, Roland's involvement in the mine expedition was mentioned, and the conversation switched to him. "The boy's work has been selling well. It was a good thing that he signed up with us. It's going to take a while till he develops further. The scrolls he makes are a hot commodity." The elf woman that worked at the store was here as well. She praised Roland's work, mentioning the great sales. The only problem was that the scrolls were still only a common grade item, and the stock was very limited. The number he could make in a month's time brought in some money, but it wasn't really that much in the grand scheme of things. The gnome nodded as the elf spoke. Since the youth returned from the mine expedition about 5 months ago, he had been working tirelessly. He unloaded quite the sizable number of spell scrolls onto him. He was clearly some kind of prodigy, as he was able to craft the highest quality common spell scrolls. He had thought that he would be a one-trick pony and continue making runic fire arrows, but he was wrong. He could scribe all of the elemental arrow types. He even gave him scrolls to sell as a bundle and explained how they worked together. One of them was the combination of wind, water, and ice that could simulate a tier 3 blizzard spell quite well and freeze opponents in a wide area. The profits from the runic scrolls were sizable, but at most, he outworked 5 regular monoscribes. He wasn't a runesmith quite yet, and the real money was in creating reusable gear for adventurers or the country's soldiers. If you managed to fetch a good commission from the noble lords to outfit their army, you could make more than by selling to sparse adventurers. The brat is working hard. He even requested smithing books from me," the gnome said while the elf woman smiled. "He's going to change classes again already." The two were baffled by Roland's progress. They figured that he couldn't be an ordinary person just by the fact that he already had his second class when he was 11. There were certain ways to increase your experience besides killing monsters and crafting. "You think he used blood crystals, manager? He doesn't seem like the type. Didn't have the telltale signs of using them." "Probably not," the gnome replied while lighting up his pipe. The elven woman cringed a bit as she saw her boss do this, not being a fan of smokers to say the least. "We have him for another 2 years, so we can watch him closely. Don't think he is a security risk," Ziliana said with a resounding nod. "Should I do some digging?" The people that complained at our shop were a dead end. They didn't seem to know much even when I asked them nicely, Tilda. The elf woman smirked a bit as she recounted how she investigated the people that were trying to return their items back to the store. They were unusually loud while doing it, as if they were told to make a scene. They haven't been hit that hard like the rest. Nothing as a poisoning incident or a monster attack at the mine happened just yet. Tighten the security. Whoever this is, they're being careful. Might be one of the council members, or even the nobles. Would also be an unknown third party that is trying to move in. Have our people report any major buyouts happening." He continued talking while riding the carriage back towards their residence. Edelgard was considered a large city of 500,000 people. The meeting place was on the other side of the city, so they would need half an hour to get back. "Well then, I'll be off first." Another little mouse appeared again, Ileana said while grinning. Her body started turning dark, and it soon turned into black smoke. She vanished from within the carriage that she occupied with the gnome. He just continued to smoke. There was no reaction on his face to the strange occurrence, as if it was something that he saw many times before. The faint screams that were heard afterward didn't garner a reaction either. Wished she didn't always leave such a mess behind. Tired of paying off the guards all the time, the manager blew out some smoke through his nose while the moon shone brightly in the night. In another place, a different scene was playing out. A certain human youth was reading a large book. A large pile of them was to the side. He was going through the pages quite fast, and his eyes were moving through the letters at a rapid pace. He finally placed it down on the table where the stack of the others was. "Think that's all?" Roland rubbed his eyes that were slightly tired and glanced at his status screen. Name: Roland Arden. L50 classes. T1 Mage, L25 Secondary. T1 Runic Mana, Scribe, L25 Main, P4, 113, 413 M, P2001, 144, 2001, 144, Sp, 496, 496, Strength, 29, Agility 33, Dexterity, 72, Vitality 32, Endurance, 31, Intelligence 1, 105 Willpower, 80 Charisma, 14 Luck 7. He went through his stats and skills. He had gathered quite a lot of them through these years. He wasn't able to rise all of them to level 9. There was just not enough time for all of that. He had to focus on his main skills like the ones for mana manipulation and crafting. He had managed to get his runic mastery up to the limit as well as both his mana scribing and runic scribing skill. He was now ready for the next step. He was only worried that there could be something more. When he wanted to change into the mana scribe, a variation of the class appeared. This was his current runic mana scribe class. He had read up in the blacksmith class. There wasn't much to get past the class change trial. Normally you just needed to craft something. It would be something easy at first like a horseshoe or some of the basic blacksmithing tools like a hook. It was a simple tool for hanging your other tools and for various other things around the smithy. Making those basic things wouldn't be much of a problem for Roland. His stats were already above what a beginner level 1 blacksmith should have. This class required a lot of strength though. This was one of the attributes that he lacked the most. In contrast, if he went for a more artisan-like class that made smaller parts, his high dexterity would be quite useful. He wasn't planning to be a goldsmith to make gold rings and necklaces though. The only slight fear that he had was that there would be a different class option like the last time. This would be good news, but he still could fail his class change quest and waste 2 small gold coins while at it. He gave out a sigh and looked at the crystal that activated the strange dimension that had his old apartment in it. "Well, if I fail, I'll just do it again." He nodded to himself. He had read all the smithing-related books that he could find. There were also some basic rune smithing books there, but they didn't go into much detail about how rune crafting or runic inscriptions. Roland grasped the class-changing stone and stared at it before activating it as he did before. He arrived in the usual spot at the bottom of the apartment building. The outside looked dead, as always. He just turned around and walked slowly upstairs. His room was the same, and he went straight to the computer. He heard the fans turning on and the system asking him for his password the same as before. There are a lot of them this time. After going straight to the program that showed him the possible classes, he started looking through them. There were the usual Tier 1 classes like Archer, Warrior, Scout there, but just as he expected, there were some Tier 2 classes available now. Advanced Mana Scribe, Advanced Runic Mana Scribe are there. He leveled up both of his scribing skills to the max, and along with the skills that he had from his mage class. He reasoned that this was enough to allow him to change to these classes. He felt like going with the Tier 2 Advanced Runic Mana Scribe class wouldn't be such a bad idea. He looked through the side of the window that should have the more magical classes and frowned. There really weren't any Tier 2 mage classes available. He was hoping that something like a rune mage class would appear, but apparently that wasn't the case. He turned his gaze to the other side where the blacksmith class was the last time he went through a class change. To no surprise, it was still there. It showed an icon of a pixelated version of him. The pixel art was wearing the usual blacksmith apparel along with a large hammer. Instead of the walking animation, it was showing him sitting down and hammering a large anvil. He started looking to the sides, just as he suspected it was there. Roland's mouth curled up slightly. The name of the class that he was hoping to get was similar to the one he currently had. Runic Blacksmith. He gave out a sigh. He wasn't sure what he would be able to craft with this class in his position, but he should at least be able to inscribe some runes on metal. Wait, does that mean there is a runic runesmith class after this? He paused a bit before thinking, would a runic runesmith add something to a class that was already working with runes? He might have been overthinking this. Maybe he wouldn't even need to take that class to forge runes. What if there are runic variations of all the smithing classes, and I can skip the tier 2 one altogether? He thought to himself. He had a theory that if he would be getting certain rune-related skills now, that the runesmith class only had then, he might be able to skip it. There could also be a better version of this class waiting for him. He continued thinking before finally snapping out of it. He needed to first finish this class change quest before he could think about the tier 2 classes. He scanned the other classes with his eyes that could become available to him, and to his surprise there were others. Runic Archer, Runic Warrior all littered the interface and could be taken by him. He believed that these classes would probably only lower the usage of mana with rune weapons and wouldn't actually differ much from the regular versions of those classes. They probably became available after he leveled up his runic mastery and might not offer that much to him in the long run. If he went with that route, he would have wasted time with crafting runes and would have to switch to melee combat. He might be able to fight better with runic gear, but it was still better to customize it yourself. Roland finally made up his mind and clicked on the runic blacksmith variant that was available to him. The usual VR headset popped out, and he put it right on just like last time. He was transported into another area. The place looked like a regular blacksmith's workshop like he saw in the city. It wasn't all that large, but he could see it had all the things required for one. The forge, water barrel, and quench tank were close to each other. The tool rack with the basic smithing tools like tongs and hammers was all there. The anvil was right in the middle, and a bit further away was the workbench with a book on it. He walked up to it while remembering his first class change mission that was similar to this setup. Just as before, he needed to read through it to get the temporary skills, and then craft the required item. He spotted a large hourglass in the corner that was already counting down the time. He moved forward and grabbed the large book. He hoped to get an easy item for crafting like some nails. He received an unexpected thing instead. This even prompted him to raise an eyebrow. How to forge a ladle of lesser fire resistance. Chapter 35. Crafting a ladle. Basic forging temporary. Basic smithing mastery temporary. Basic runecraft temporary. Gained. Roland put the crafting instructions to the side. He had gained the knowledge about how to craft a blacksmith's ladle that was used in forging. He didn't think that something like this would be his first piece of work. He also needed to inscribe a rune on the metal tool before he could consider it finished. He looked at the tool rack and started picking out the tools and resources that he would need for this task. He didn't come unprepared. He had gone through many crafting textbooks. He even examined how the other smiths were doing their work while out in the city. He even tried paying a few to give him some lessons, but they weren't willing to show him their trade secrets. They mistakenly thought that he was someone spying from another smithy. Roland didn't want to ask the manager for help, so he settled for only watching from afar. That didn't last for long, as he was removed after being spotted after a couple of days. He nodded to himself while he started placing the items and tools that he would require to forge this ladle. First came the blacksmith's hammers, which were the staple of the craft. Next came a pair of shears meant for cutting thinner pieces of metal. A punch to make the holes that he could then attach the round ladle end with, rivets, and some other things. He managed to find everything in this small smithy. He gazed at the tools on the table one more time. It was time to get to work. First, he needed a thinner piece of sheet metal. He grabbed the resource from the side and started cutting. He realized why strength was such an important stat for a blacksmith. Even cutting this was quite strenuous, as the metal sheet wasn't all that thin. He managed to make an almost perfect circle, but it wasn't quite there. He placed it into a vise. Then he took out a large file to smooth it out. After he was finished, he placed it to the side. Next, he grabbed a swage block. This tool was mostly a heavy block made from iron or steel. It had various holes in different shapes and sizes. The one that he grabbed was already prepared beforehand, as it was a cupping swage design used for spoons and ladles. He also grasped tongs, as the forge would finally be going to be used. The previously cut-out circle needed to be heated up. He had to concentrate now as fire was involved. Keeping it controlled was a must. Too little heat and the metal would be too hard to forge and more prone to cracking. Too much heat and he would burn or melt the metal, making it useless in the process. The amount of oxygen in the fire was also important, as too much air led to increased oxide, which was also known as scale. This he needed to avoid. The fire temperature and oxygen control played a huge role in how easily a blacksmith could forge. The type of fire a blacksmith got also relied on the type of fuel he was using. Charcoal, wood, and even magic fire, which was considered the best as it burned at a more stable rate. Luckily, the fire he was working with here was magical, and he didn't need to light it up himself. He opened up the forge and made sure to hold the metal piece with the tongs snugly. The tongs didn't hold the metal tightly. The metal could become a very hot, very dangerous projectile when hammering it. He placed the heated metal on the cupping swage that was on the anvil and got to work. Roland held the round piece of metal with his tongs. His other hand was now holding a rounding hammer, and he began dishing out hammer blows. He started from the center of the circle and continued working his way out in a spiral pattern. He worked with overlapping hammer blows as he smoothed the base of the ladle into a rounder shape. This took him some time. This was the first time he was crafting as a smith. Luckily his dexterity also played a moderate role in this, so he was able to land the blows in all the correct places. The blacksmithing skills were also helping him out with what he was supposed to be doing. He managed to finish up with this part and moved on to the next one. For the next step, he needed an iron rod. This would be the handle, and would probably require the most hammering work. He heated it up once again in the furnace, and began tapering one of the ends on the far side of the anvil with full face hammer blows, until the taper was at the length that he wanted it. One of the basics of blacksmithing were the types of hammer blows. They varied based on how a blacksmith was hammering the metal in relation to the anvil: full-faced, half-faced, and shearing. All of these blows could be done on any part or edge of the anvil as well as at any angle to isolate and fuller the metal. With a full-faced blow, the metal is fully pinched between the hammer and anvil. Such a blow was used to taper, draw, and smooth the steel. With a half-faced blow, the metal was forged only partially on the anvil to either create a shoulder in the metal or to protect another area from being forged. A half-faced blow could also be used to fuller and isolate metal more efficiently. With a shearing blow, the hammer does not hit the anvil at all. It is used to bend steel and could be done over the edge of the anvil, the horn, or on some other tool. He started curling the end of the handle's taper over the rounded far edge of the anvil. Then he began shaping it, which was also called scrolling. He did it by holding the rod flat on the anvil, and continued hammering back towards himself. This would give the handle a nice curved shape, and was apparently a requirement for this type of ladle. His hands started to get tired and his stamina points were going down. He continued bending the handle, until it managed to turn into a proper scroll. He then continued by bending the end further approximately 45 degrees to one side over the far side of the anvil to create a ring at the end. He placed the little loop in the anvil's spike, and finished up the handle shape with some more hammer strikes before quenching it. With the handle now finished, he moved on to the other end to which the oval ladle would be attached to. The sounds of a hammer hitting on metal continued while Roland sweated. After some time he managed to finally get the other end into a somewhat good shape. Now he needed to punch some holes through it. The tool for this was also called a punch, and it did just that. It was just something that looked like a larger nail, but was more spherical, and with a flat or round spot to hammer at the end. With a couple of well-placed blows, he had two nicely shaped holes for the rivets he was going to use. He also needed to do the same for the ladle part, as he needed the rivets to go through both of those parts. He assembled the ladle and handle together, as they were now ready for the rivets. This was the most common way to fasten two parts together as a regular blacksmith. Welding was possible with some runic equipment, but it drained a lot of mana, so it was limited to high-level people. He was lucky enough that this virtual smithing workshop came with pre-made rivets, so he wouldn't have to make them himself. He placed the ladle head on the outside of the anvil with the handle resting over it. The rivets were heated up before the hammering process. He looked at his creation and frowned a bit. It did look somewhat like a ladle, but it wasn't finished quite yet. If this was the regular blacksmith class, that would be it, but he still needed to place the lesser fire resistance rune on it. Roland turned to the hourglass and could tell that it was already more than half empty. Smithing took a lot longer than scribing, and this was something that he realized. Now came the rune craft. This process was not that similar to the scribing one. Magic ink wouldn't be required, but he still needed to use the hammer he was provided with. What he needed for it was his full attention and a lot of mana. Rune crafting or inscribing just consisted of forcing your mana into the desired object. The process was a lot rougher than scribing, though, as you needed to transfer your mana via hammer strikes to the metal. The metal needed to be softened by heating it up. You could try forcing your mana directly without a hammer, but this was a lot harder. It also demanded a massive amount of mana and concentration. The rune crafting skill changed the properties of your mana slightly and allowed it to seep into the metal by force. It was finally time. There would be no second chance to do this, and he knew it. Even if he was able to inscribe the rune fast, he wouldn't be able to reforge this ladle in time again. Here goes nothing. He even considered praying to Solaria for a moment before placing his hand on the handle. The whole item was heated up once more. The color shifted from dark to red quite fast. He wouldn't be hitting the tool hard enough to make it bend. He just needed to transfer his energies into it and forge the rune structure. The hammer he was holding started glowing as he moved it above his head and slammed it down. The ladle shook slightly and mana seeped into it, while creating some of the magical runic pathways and components in the process. Just by the first hit, he noticed that this would be really hard. His mana points dropped by a staggering number, and he barely started. He repeated the process several times. Each time he struck the iron object, blue sparks of magical energy flew. The runic symbols started appearing on the handle bit by bit as he continued. He finally stopped after one of the runes was practically finished, half of his mana pool already gone at this point. He finally understood why, unless you were a tier 2 class, you had practically no chance of doing a thing like this. Even with his oversized mana pool, he was already running low. Luckily, the process of rune crafting could be broken up, as the mana pathways weren't created by magic ink. He looked to the hourglass and waited. He needed to recover his mana before continuing. If his mana dropped too far, he would have trouble concentrating, and he could even pass out. When more than 3/4 of the sand was gone, he resumed his work. The first part of the rune was done, which was responsible for the fire portion. He still needed to inscribe the one that was meant for resistance, and also cover the whole ladle with thin magical pathways. Unless he placed the traces over the whole length, the item would not function correctly. The sand continued to run out, and he started feeling dizzy. Even while waiting, and having recharged some of his lost mana, he was slowly reaching his limit. He needed to dip into his reserves even more. His face became pale, and he felt like someone was inserting nails into both his ears, but he continued hammering. Ladle of lesser fire resistance, lesser. Lowest, high. He managed to last till the end without passing out, and received a strange rating for his item. It had both the lowest and high grade. The lesser part was probably the rank of the item, which was low due to it just being a plain iron ladle. There was probably one reason for this type of rating. The rune he forged was of high quality, but the ladle as an item was barely passable. He was brought back to his room, after managing to pass his second, tier 1 class change. He was now a runic blacksmith. Before he could celebrate, though, he had to grab his waste bin. He placed his entire head into it before puking his supper out into it. His mana had dropped all the way to 1%. He quickly wobbled over to his spatial bag, and pulled out a mana potion, which he promptly drank. It tasted terrible, but it was just the thing he needed. In a matter of minutes, he managed to recover over 200 points of mana, which took care of his migraine. He crawled over to his bed, that had improved within the year as he had switched to a more expensive residence. Will all of these special class changes be like this? He barely passed the scribe class change, and it was the same with this one. This was the punishment for crossing over tiers. His stats weren't quite up to par. He already was fearing what a tier 2 class change would have in store for him, as he was barely making it through tier 1. Basic forging passive skill unlocks the basics of forging to the blacksmith class. Aids in managing the forge, crafting, and spotting imperfections in created items. Basic smithing mastery, passive skill. Increases the proficiency with all basic blacksmithing tools like hammers. Basic runecraft skill unlocks basic runecraft, which allows inscription of magical runes on various items. Runic blacksmith class increases stamina by 15% and mana by 10%. Lowers mana consumption while inscribing runes. He checked out his skills, and what the bonus for the runic variant of the blacksmith class would be. The usual blacksmith bonus was only to increase the stamina. He was even getting a boost to his mana. The bonus related to inscribing runes was similar to the scribe class, but it probably didn't work on the spell scrolls and more. He also lost the mana regeneration bonus that class was giving him. Roland would have to test out which class was better for crafting later, as he could switch his secondary class once a day. He was tired. He barely made it through this class change. If he didn't have both of his classes and his large mana pool, he would never have made it through. The only thing he wanted to do now was sleep. In the morning he would go talk to his boss and ask for a place to train his craft. He was a bit dejected about how bad he was. He was barely able to make a crude spoon. What, already? Yeah, don't worry, I'll keep making scrolls just like the contract stated. It was the next day and Roland was looking at a surprised gnome. Not a day after he talked with his elven worker about this youth's quick progress, he had already managed to change classes. He wanted to examine him with his skill, but the trinket that he lent him even worked on someone of his caliber. Give me a few dies, I'll see what I can do. The manager didn't have any reason to deny Roland. He was still a promising worker, and if he could craft more things then, it would be good for his business. Still, it was a shame that he was going to take time off scribing to create crude blacksmith tools. He was still unaware of Roland's special class. Think there was an unused small warehouse, could give it to the kid, the manager thought to himself. He had promised in the contract to provide Roland a place to work, but it didn't say how well equipped it had to be. The kid could just spend his own money to get the more expensive stuff or just buy the materials from his store. He would just provide the bare minimum iron tools. While the new place was being prepared, Roland headed out. He knew how this gnome operated, as he wouldn't even give him a good deal on the materials. The thing he was mostly interested in now was runic equipment. He needed to get some rune diagrams designed for wearable gear instead of the runic spells this time around. Finally, his life as a smith had begun. He just needed to stick with it and work hard. With time he would probably be able to match the newbie runesmiths. If he could earn money making flame-resistant spoons was still out for debate. Chapter 36. Getting a workshop. Roland gave out a yawn and moved his head to the side. His dome was sticking out from under a blanket, and he could feel a cold breeze coming in through the window. He rose up and stretched while yawning, his eyes still a bit sluggish. He had gained some form of freedom through the years, but he still was somehow used to getting up early in the morning. This day was going to be slightly different than the rest. The new workshop that he was promised was going to be open today. He was going to work there now, instead of going to Xior's Magic Emporium. As he was now a runic blacksmith, he needed more space to practice his smithing-related skills. The manager had delivered on his promise, and he would move to the new workshop today. He was going to live there as well. He wouldn't need this inn's room anymore. The place he was going to work in had a smaller space for a bedroom where he could spend the night in. He wouldn't get it for free though. He would pay rent and still need to produce the minimum number of 10 spell scrolls a week. He wasn't happy about the workload increase, as he wanted to get his smithing skills into higher levels. His scribing skills couldn't be leveled up further. The higher tier skill was only unlocked after getting a tier 2 advanced runic mana scribe class. Still, making runic scrolls was his only way of making a living, at least for now. He managed to create some runic weapons. He figured that the gnome manager would exchange them for the scrolls, as they brought in more money. This was also why they were a lot harder to make. He realized this when he was changing classes and inscribing his first rune. The sheer amount of mana used for even a lesser rune was astronomical. The mana he spent on that one fire-resisted ladle was enough for him to create 5 common fire arrow spells. He couldn't even finish it in one go and needed to wait for his mana to regenerate. If he tried it in one go, he would have probably passed out from the splitting headache. He got up from bed and got dressed. He wore his usual robe with some casual clothes underneath. He didn't wear the gambeson armor this time as it was too thick. It was fine to wear outdoors, as it was cold there. Inside, on the other hand, it just made him sweat a lot. He had also exchanged his spatial bag for a larger model. He could fit 3 times as much into this one. Carrying all of his baggage and resources was now finally possible. After clearing out the room, he returned the key to the innkeeper. The man didn't react much, as having old tenants leave was a common occurrence. He was over 12 years of age now, and he would be getting a place of his own already. His plans of starting his own business were looking bright, but he wasn't sure if the council that ruled this place would allow him to open up his own store just yet. Even now he would only work at the building he was given, but it would be closed and function only as a place for crafting. He pushed the inn door open and walked out without looking behind. He decided to take a stroll through the city instead of paying for a carriage. It wasn't that cold outside, as it was summer season now. There were many other people walking back and forth. Even though it wasn't that cold, he still saw smoke coming out of many chimneys. The familiar clanging of metal on metal was heard by him as he continued towards his destination. His plan was to find a regular job at a smithy when he came to the city. A person to guide his progress would probably speed up everything. Luckily, in a world where you gain skills, repetition could replace a good master. There were enough smithing manuals to refer to. The hard part was the inscribing of runic symbols. After the trial, he had thought about something that would lessen the strain. He continued walking through the city. The further he went, the less glamorous looking the city became. He already realized that the gnome wouldn't be handing out anything for free, and the new workshop was located in the lower parts of the city. This was where most of the poor people lived. He knew that the place he would be getting wouldn't be anything special. Yeah, expected this much, he thought to himself while looking at the address. Just as in his past world, the houses did have numbers and street names. What he was looking at was an old stone building with a wooden gable roof. There seemed to be an attic with a single round window there. It didn't have any glass in it, and was nailed shut by some wooden planks. There was someone standing in front of the building, and he quickly walked over to Roland. It was a large individual that looked like some kind of worker. "You Roland?" Roland nodded, and also showed a scrap of paper that the gnome manager gave him to the man. "Everything seems to be in order. The place is yours." The man was fast to leave after seeing the introduction letter. He was just here to give the youth the keys, and make sure that no one ransacked it before the new owner moved in. Roland looked at the person disappearing into the distance before turning around. He looked at the shabby building and went in. It was a lot larger than he expected, and when he walked in he knew the reason why. This wasn't a regular house. No, this was probably a small warehouse. It had a 2 stories tall storage area, and a small office. This office was also what was going to be his living quarters. There was a loading platform in front of the warehouse to help load and unload the goods from carts and wagons. For heavier goods, there should be a simple hoist above the warehouse door, but there was none. There might have been a crane that you operated on the catwalk, but it wasn't there anymore either. Most of the space of this building was kept for storage. This gave ample room for the various smithing utensils. Right in the middle was the large anvil. It looked quite old and heavy to lift. By the wall, there was the heart of the smithy, the forge with a bellows connected to it that would allow him to infuse more air into it. This one used coal as fuel and looked quite banged up. There were some iron tools thrown into the corner. After going through them, he noticed that some were even rusty. He firstly sorted them out, bringing all the hammers in one spot while the various tongs were placed by the forge in an orderly fashion. A vise and a workbench was there, even a grindstone for sharpening. The gnome was true to his word, and had procured all the basics for him to start. He moved his gaze to the rest of his new workshop. The whole place was dusty and cobwebs were hanging from the ceiling. No one had lived in here for quite some time. The reason why this warehouse building wasn't being used was unknown to him. He could only theorize that it was either too old or in a bad location. I need to clean this place up in these kinds of situations. He wished he was a real elemental mage. He could produce water via magic. If he wanted to do that now, he would need to use a costly magic scroll. He needed water and some rags. There were wells spread through the city for these reasons. He started thinking that maybe he should hire someone to fetch things like this for him at a later occasion. The manager had said something about an assistant, but after getting the smithy, he didn't want to ask for more, at least not yet. It took him 15 minutes to come back with 2 buckets of water, and then the cleaning started. It took him quite a bit of time to get his sleeping quarters cleaned first. Scrubbing old uneven wood that wasn't painted was quite a hassle. Mold was everywhere, the shabby windows were letting the cold air in, and going up onto that catwalk seemed like an accident waiting to happen. Roland dropped dead on his new bed after cleaning the whole place and somehow getting everything in order. He was already rethinking his approach of starting a solo career. Maybe working in someone else's workshop would be less of a hassle. Then the memories of his old life, where he was forced by his old boss to work overtime each day, resurfaced. This brought back his stubborn side, and he quickly decided to power through this small setback. Luckily, it was a warmer part of the year, and the night went past without much of a problem. A new bed that he wasn't used had caused him not to be well rested. This was still a marked building under the umbrella of Ixior, so he didn't fear that he would be ransacked in the future. The thieves and bandits in this city mostly evaded the businesses run by the council members. On the next day, he was finally ready to work. He had bought some bronze ingots for this occasion along with some iron ones. Besides those, he also had other materials. There was an old smelter here. He just needed to make some molds for it. He would mostly use bronze and iron for the time being. Even though iron was still a bit hard to inscribe runes on, it was good to train his smithing skills on. The bronze would be used for the next phase, which was runecraft. Bronze had a lower melting point than iron. He believed that it would also be easier to inscribe runes onto it. He finally started up the forge. He wasn't planning on doing anything out of the ordinary, just some nails. He had read from the books, and just making those would count as experience, and towards his tool-related skills. He would be making these nails from iron this time around. He had a 1 cm wide iron stock for this, which was just a plain long iron rod. He also had a slightly rusty nail header. This tool had a small hook on one side, and a rounder flat end on the other, with a hole going through it. It was also used for riveting. The last tool was a hardy hot cut tool with which he would use to cut the heated rod. First, he used his ember spell to start a fire, and waited for the coals to reach a high enough temperature. The rod he was using was long enough for him to hold it with his hands, but he still used some gloves for added safety. When the metal turned red, he brought it over to the anvil, and started hammering it. Only the tip of the rod was on the anvil, as he only needed to taper a small length that would be the nail. After getting the tip into the correct nail shape, he firstly put it through the nail header to see if it fit. After this, he placed the hardy tool on the anvil, and the hot part of the rod against it. He started hammering it over and over again while twisting it around. He left a small part intact, and didn't fully cut through it, as the nail header would be used to twist it off. He placed the rounded part of the nail header onto the anvil, where a special circular hole was. With the almost complete nail now in the nail header, and on the anvil, he started hammering the top. Soon the nail took its final shape, and he dropped it to the side. Created iron nail lesser. Low, gained 1 XP. He raised an eyebrow at the amount of experience that he got from this. This was the minimum you could get for any kind of action. With this being his 3rd tier 1 class, this probably wasn't the best way to level up. Glad that I haven't really made that many schematics of the item-related runes. He gave out a sigh after seeing the meager experience that he received. He was happy that he managed to make something that wasn't graded as lowest at least. He continued making those nails until there was no more stock to work with. He didn't manage to level up any of his blacksmith skills just yet. If he did after making some crude nails, then it would have been far too easy. He continued practicing making nails while taking some downtime and creating some spell scrolls. He still needed to keep the minimum up or even more. He now had a workshop, and he would need to spend money on new materials. The nails that he was making were too small for rune inscribing, at least for the time being. He would either smelt them down into something else or use them to hang out more tools on the walls. After a full day of making tools, his basic smithing mastery reached level 2. He even received a bonus point in strength for it. His basic forging didn't go up quite yet. He would probably need to start smelting and working the forge more for that. Before the day ended, he decided to perform one more test. He had gotten himself a slightly thicker metal plate that was made from bronze, and one also made from iron. He brought them over to the workbench. He placed his hand on the bronze plate first and activated his runecrafting skill. He wanted to test if he could do this without heating the metal up and without a hammer. His fingers glowed blue and his mana seeped into the bronze. He could instantly tell that this wouldn't be going his way. He continued for a whole minute, but then stopped and glanced at the piece of metal with a frown on his face. Even on something like bronze, this would take forever. His mana points were halved and maybe 1/10 of the first lesser rune was there. He could regenerate this lost mana, but the less of it he had, the slower the regeneration process became. If he dipped into his reserves and burned through 90% of his mana, it would take him about 2 hours to regenerate it. At 50% the time would be halved, and above 70% it was even faster. This was also why most mages didn't cast many spells if they didn't have to, and tried keeping their mana high at all times. He stopped himself from dumping more than 50% of his mana into this bronze plate. He sat down and meditated a bit to get his mana regeneration churning. After getting back to 100% he resumed, but this time with a hammer. His hammer blows struck the heated up bronze plate and seeped inside its structure. He felt that this was already a lot easier than working with iron. The mana usage was lowered, as there was less resistance in the material for him to work with. Bronze plate of the fire orb lesser, lowest, high. He looked at his creation. He wasn't able to create the highest rating for the rune quite yet. As a scribe, making this lesser spell would have been a cakewalk. Here on the other hand, he was barely able to make one at the high grade, while using most of his mana. This wasn't the purpose of this test though. He grabbed the bronze plate with the long name and poured some of his remaining mana into it. The moment he activated the runic spell structure, an orb of red light appeared above it. It continued to glow while he powered it with his mana. He placed it back on the anvil after deactivating the spell and started to examine it. The spell structure is still in place, nothing out of the ordinary. He picked it up again and made the orb appear again with a slight grin on his face. He had managed to make a reusable spell. He was now able to do it. This opened up new possibilities. He wouldn't be limited to one-use spell scrolls anymore. I need to perform more tests. He needed to know how thin he could make the metal plate before the runic spell became unstable. He needed to test how fast the spell deteriorated, as he knew that these items had a shelf life. His mind was already thinking ahead. He wanted to deck himself out with full runic armor. This would have to wait though, as he had trouble even making iron nails. Roland wasn't in a rush. He had enough time for everything. The day turned into night, and people could hear the sound of metal hitting other metal. An orange light was seen through the cracks in the warehouse, along with a cone of smoke gushing out of the chimney. A new part of life had started for Roland, and it was a lot sooner than he had expected. What he could achieve with this class was still unknown, but he would slowly figure it out. Chapter 37. Testing new items. A group of gray goblins was just standing around the remains of some kind of deer-looking creature. This creature was at least twice the size of what a regular deer would be, and it had razor-sharp antlers to go with it. It seemed to not have gone down without a fight, as 4 dead goblins were right next to its corpse. One of the humanoid monsters was a head taller than the rest, and was holding on to a rusty longsword. It was apparent that it was the leader of this group with one glance. He shouted something in the goblin language at the other members of its tribe. It looked quite angry, and the others started backing away from the monster's remains. He obviously wanted first dibs on the juicy meat. His mouth was already salivating, and the drool was running down the monster's chin. Before it could sink its yellowy teeth into the moist meat, it noticed something. It quickly turned around and swung its longsword upwards. This was just in time to smack a blue bolt of magic energy to the side. The evolved goblin's muscular hand trembled a bit, and the longsword shook violently as it successfully defended itself. The other goblins started shouting while swinging their own rusty weapons around. This wasn't the end of the magical attacks. Soon another bolt of energy flew towards the monsters, now hitting one of the regular goblins. Its head exploded into chunks of meat as it fell down to the ground. The assault continued, and bolts of blue energy rained from above while the monsters panicked. The evolved variant was smart enough to take cover behind some trees. It peeked out while looking for one of the magical attacks. Soon he saw it going through one of its tribe members. Through one of its abilities, it was able to pinpoint the position that this attack came from by its flight path. It gave out a war cry and charged forward. The rest of the scared goblins quickly recovered and followed after. With the enemy position getting closer and closer, it gave chase. It had fought many ranged opponents before. It knew that it needed to close the distance before it could gain victory. It used the trees and the other goblins as shields and pushed towards from where these blue orbs of light were shooting from. Soon enough it finally spotted its prey. It was a single person in a black robe standing up on a ledge that was looking down into the forest. The being looked human, and it had 2 strange items in its hand. The goblin leader saw the human point one of the things he was holding towards him. The moment he did, it gave off blue light, and one of those energy missiles flew out. He quickly dodged to the side to evade it, but it grazed past his shoulder and produced a wound. The goblin monster's eyes turned red after it felt pain, and it gave out a massive war cry. The human moved his other hand forward and shot off another spell. The magic bolt connected with the rusty sword yet again, causing it to finally snap, but it couldn't stop the goblin's rage-filled charge. It bolted forward, activating some kind of skill that increased its speed and turned its skin blood red. The human in the robe above the ledge flinched slightly before firing off another magic spell that connected with the enraged monster. It didn't manage to slow it down at all as it bounced off its now red skin. The goblin bolted forward with large strides. The steep ledge didn't seem like it would be able to stop its approach. The moment it started climbing, the human started moving back into the forest. The goblin wouldn't let this enemy flee. It felt like it had it cornered and just needed to get closer for the kill. It arrived on the top of the ledge in a matter of seconds. The skill it used had boosted its stats by a staggering amount. When it got to the top, it could see the human backing away against a tree. It had him cornered. There was no escape for its prey. The human brought out some other item, and while the goblin was charging, created some kind of barrier. The monster didn't care. It would rip a flimsy magic shield like that with its bare hands. At least that's what was supposed to happen. Instead, while charging forward, it stepped onto something. It felt like recently dug up ground with something soft underneath it. Soon after, an explosion occurred. The blast shot upwards while concentrating mostly on the creature's foot. It was blown clean off while the monster tumbled. The shield that the human put up was enough to protect him from the blast. The monster was missing a foot along with the part of its leg. It couldn't move, and its skin returned to the usual gray color. The human, without approaching, took out some kind of parchment and pointed it at the monster. It couldn't react or move with the missing leg as a sizzling hot arrow of fire energy connected with its body. The mage continued using the scrolls on the evolved monster till it drew its last breath. Grey Hobgoblin Berserker all 59 slain, gain 950 XP. Roland looked at the dead monster in front of him while panting. He came to this goblin-infested forest yet again to test out his new weapons. He didn't expect to find a Tier 2 monster here though. After killing the hobgoblin, his goblin killing title evolved into Goblin Slaughterer. Goblin Slaughterer title: a person with this title causes lesser goblins to run away in fear. A person with this title does 10% more damage to any goblin-type monster. This forest was still dangerous and left alone by the city lord and his army. There weren't any farms in these mountains, so people didn't bother with clearing up the goblin infestation unless someone complained. This mostly came from traveling merchants that sometimes got attacked while traveling towards the city. Most of the time, the monsters didn't leave the forest and just hunted other monsters or animals for food. He was quite far on the ledge before he fired off his spell. He thought that it might have been just an evolved Tier 1 variant of the goblin from way over here. Instead, it turned out to be a hobgoblin. Luckily, it was still low-leveled for a Tier 2, so he managed to somehow defeat it. He did this by preparing traps around his casting area, as he was afraid that some other monsters might try sneaking upon him. He placed spell scrolls on the ground and covered them with a small amount of dirt. This special scroll, when activated, lay dormant until pressure was applied to it. This was an improved version of his explosion rune that he used to detonate the mine wall back when he was stuck in it. There were peculiar spells that could be triggered like this. He just needed to isolate the components responsible and then add it to other runes. He couldn't actually program them yet. This wasn't the item he was here to test though. The hobgoblin saw those items as he was using them from afar. This weapon looked a bit peculiar. It had a regular-looking handle with a flat, almost rectangular shaft above it. It looked similar to a hand paddle. Yes, this was a sort of one that Roland had created. It more or less looked like a paddle meant for spanking with intricate rune designs on the shaft part. He had inscribed the Mana Bolt spell on 2 of these weapons to test how much they would last. They were made from bronze, as it was easier to work with. He had fired tens of mana bolts towards the goblins, and he was now down to about 30% of his mana. The makeshift bronze magic wands worked, but at a price. This was the easiest attacking spell that was out there, but it needed a massive amount of mana to be cast. He needed 75 mana points to perform this spell through this wand he made. The spell couldn't be spammed too fast, but if he had 2 wands he could use them interchangeably. He had fired off about 10 mana bolts with each wand and killed over 10 of the normal goblins along with this hobgoblin. For the leader, he needed some of his runic scrolls. This new weapon already saved him a lot of money. He would need to use up 20 scrolls to get a similar effect. Thanks to this, he saved a lot of money and resources. Bronze was also quite cheap compared to magic ink and special scroll paper. The remaining goblins had run away after their leader had been slain, and none of them even tried climbing up to where Roland was standing now. He used this time to examine one of his mana bolt weapons. He could see some deterioration to the runic inscriptions already, and he knew that after 10 more the wand would stop working. This was normal for runic equipment made from regular metal. If he made them from iron, he would only slightly increase the uses up to a 30. A weapon like this could be repaired, and the rune crafting process would use up less mana. I need to lower the mana usage on these. Roland rubbed his chin, and then attached both of the paddle wands to his belt. He was still in the forest, so he needed to be vigilant. He went through the hobgoblin and took the broken longsword hilt from its remains. He could smelt it down for parts. He also removed quite a large marble-sized mana stone. It would fetch a nice price if he sold it. There was also another use for it. He held the shiny gem between his thumb and pointing finger. He could see the mana crystal slowly absorbing the ambient mana and the surroundings even now. He knew that there was some kind of way of embedding these mana stones into runic or enchanted weapons. An item with a mana crystal in it would be far stronger than one without it. It would also act as a battery, allowing people with low mana to activate any inscribed spells more and at a lower cost. The problem was that he had no idea how to do this. He would need to either find an instruction manual or get a weapon with a monster core in it and examine it. He peeked to the forest where the other goblins were. Their small bloodied bodies were everywhere. Soon some other monsters would probably smell all this fresh meat and come on over. He didn't feel like going down there to take a couple of mana stones was worth the hassle. His agility wasn't that high, and he didn't think he could outrun a pack of monster hounds either. The goblins weren't the only creatures living in this forest, and he had other ways of earning money. Roland had already activated the detonating scrolls, and he couldn't defuse them. They would stop working after an hour, but he couldn't just leave them there. He stepped away and grabbed a couple of rocks. He just threw them at the spots the mines were in and detonated each one of them before finally leaving the forest. The hobgoblin body was tossed into his spatial bag that was now large enough to hold it. There were several parts of this body that could be used as medicine or alchemy ingredients. He could just sell it to his gnome boss, and they would take care of the rest. He departed back to the city and was back before dawn. He was really on the fence about being in a city with no dungeon. He thought that he would be done with hunting monsters after getting his blacksmith class. There he was, making weapons and killing monsters with them himself. These wands that he made wouldn't be that great for mages or other classes. The trained magic casters gained skills to lower casting times and even forego spoken incantations. Why would they want to use an item that used up their precious mana 2 or 3 times faster? He also worked in parties. The people in them were always protecting them. They also needed to save their mana to cast the more powerful spells, which were what they were there for in the first place. Before going back to his workshop, he went towards the Adventurer Guild. The gambeson that he was wearing under his robe kept his body warm. He had grown close to 170 cm in height now, and due to working out in the smithy, his muscles were growing as well. He felt like he was on the taller side compared to kids his age. When his growth spurt would stop, he didn't know. His larger body size allowed him to appear older than he actually was, so that was a bonus. He arrived at the Adventurer Guild and made his way to one of the receptionists. "I'd like to have a monster's remains processed." "What kind of monster?" the lady receptionist asked while looking at Roland. "It's a hobgoblin berserker." The receptionist lady raised an eyebrow while glancing at the youth that was covering his face. By the card that he gave her, he seemed like a steel-grade adventurer, and not a silver one. She speculated that he must have just found the body somewhere. The guild wouldn't go into too many details when it came to that. Other adventurers sometimes left untouched bodies behind, and others were free to pick up the scraps. "Hobgoblin berserker, are you familiar with our rates? After the body is processed by our employee, you will receive your coin. It shouldn't take more than 3 days. "Yes, that's fine. I'll come back later." Roland nodded, and the receptionist told him to go into one of the back rooms. She also gave him a small metal plaque with a number, along with a tag with the same number on it. On the inside, there was a corridor that led to a certain door. When he entered, he felt the temperature drop by several degrees. He could see some frozen, cut-up bodies of monsters hanging off hooks. "Got a body? Just drop it there." He heard a man's voice. It belonged to a bearded man that seemed to be human. He was working on some kind of spider-looking monster. He was just in time to see him pull out its fangs with some large dentist-looking pliers. He didn't remain here for long. He just dropped the hobgoblin on the ground. The man just gave it a side glance while continuing his work. "Here is the tag number." Roland dropped the item that the receptionist gave him on the body while the man just nodded. The man would attach the tag to this monster, and when Roland came back, he just needed to show the plaque to receive his money. This was a common thing around here. You could process the monster remains on your own to save some money or give it to a professional. He would cut up the body, and the guild would sell the parts for profit. Roland would get 70% from this transaction, which was fine as he didn't really want to play around with the monster bodies himself. Even though the man looked disinterested, Roland knew that the guild wouldn't try to play him. He left the cold room soon after and went back to his workshop. He wanted to repair his paddle wands, as he did get experience from it. The more destroyed the item was, the more he got. While the sun was starting to go down, another scene was playing out in a different location. A group of people was standing in a dimly lit room while talking. They looked like your average riffraff. They seemed quite shady. All of them were wearing hoods, and some even had masks to cover their mouths. "Listen up, we have a new job," one of the men said while the others listened in. "New job? Hope the pay is good," another man chimed in while the others nodded. "Don't worry, the client has deep pockets." The man grinned while tossing a full sack of coins on the table. The other men in the room looked at it with greed in their eyes. They started grinning and laughing, while at the same having a hard time keeping their hands from the silver coins. "This is just a down payment. We will get more after the job is done." "Just a down payment? Are we robbing or killing someone?" one of the ruffians asked, as this was far too much money for a simple job of thievery. "That's the thing, we don't really need to do much. There is an old warehouse that reopened in Southtown. We just need to trash the place. What of the people working there?" The man looked up to one of the thugs that asked and pulled out a knife. There was a map on a table with the position of this warehouse. He plunged this bent dagger into the location of their target before replying. "What do you think?" All of them nodded as they started to prepare for the night. When the moon reached the zenith, they would strike. Chapter 38. Home Invasion. Roland closed the door behind him after he entered his workshop. On the inside, there were many tools hung up on the walls. Using his new class, he had cleaned up the place and even set up some shelves. He started segregating every resource he had, like iron, bronze, and copper. Even during his work, he was sure to even pick up the metal shavings. He had a working smelter which he could use to melt these leftover metals into ingots. He also was thinking about making clay molds. With them, he was planning to make his first sword from bronze. This would hasten the process by quite a bit, as he wouldn't need to hammer it into shape that much. He already had spent some time practicing his craft, but he had only reached the second level of his blacksmith class. This was already showing him that he would be spending a lot more time with this third one. Only after this, he would finally be getting into the Tier 2 smith territory. He wasn't sure if there would be a prestige class waiting for him then. He had to level up his rune crafting and all the smithing-related skills to the maximum before the job class quest, to be sure. All of those smithing skills that he received, runecraft included, were at level 2 now. He could already feel that he was getting better at his new craft. The strain that rune crafting put on him was slightly lower now. He'll needed to go through all of his mana to finish a lesser rune within a day though. This was when working with a soft material like bronze. Iron would double or triple the time spent, and one of the rare metals would make it impossible. The basic rune crafting skill had its limit, and the larger the size of the metal the longer it took. Inscribing the traces wasn't that easy, and they had to be placed through most of the weapon. He placed the two paddle-like wands on his workbench and glanced at them. There was a reason he made them like this. Due to his runecraft skill being so low, he couldn't compress the runes as much. His creations had to be large just for the entire rune to fit in. He had decided on the mana bolt spell as it was the smallest one from his repertoire. With his high mana pool and his runic mastery that was lowering the casting costs, this weapon was very usable. He wanted to move on to the next step and inscribe a common rune, but there was a problem. First, a common rune was many times harder to make. He would probably need from 4 days to a week for it. The second problem was the size. He barely got the lesser mana bolt on this large paddle-shaped mass of bronze. He calculated that if he wanted to create a similar weapon, while keeping the shape, he would end up with something like a tennis racket instead. It would be made from bronze or iron, and the balance would be a real problem. He could try to make the handle from wood, but then another problem arose. Mixing two different materials with each other and connecting runic pathways through those. It was somewhat easy to scribe a rune on one large piece of metal. The traces flowed into each other without a hitch. But even adding a wooden handle or cloth on top would make things difficult. There just needed to be direct contact. The mana a person injected into the item dissipated really fast unless you had the runic pathways close by. The only way he had to go around this was somehow riveting the parts together, while not using the wood as part of the rune. Wood was also a lot worse for rune crafting, as it just didn't cope with the mana pathways well. You needed certain magical wood for something like that, which made runic bows a lot more costly and harder to make. Roland thought that there had to be some kind of way to connect armor and weapon parts with each other. Even some swords had a hilt, pommel, and guard that were inserted separately. There had to be some kind of way to connect these parts without them having to be one solid piece of metal. There might have been a skill that a Tier 2 runesmith achieved, or one that could be learned from a skill book. He would need to go ask around or buy some information later. For now, he had to repair his magical paddles. He started up the forge with the help of his ember spell and some coal. This coal had a high enough temperature to work with bronze and iron. If he wanted to move over to the better magical metals, he would need a better fuel source. This also meant that he could work with regular steel in the future with this basic forging equipment. There was a version of iron ore that had absorbed mana called deep iron. It was found deep inside the earth closer to its core and gave runic equipment more spell usage. You could make black steel from it that improved upon its qualities even more. This was one of the better metals that wasn't all that pricey. It was cheaper than merthil. That material was mostly used by people of Tier 3 and above. They were mostly the only ones rich enough to afford something like that. There was also a limit on the materials. Common bronze wouldn't be able to contain a grand rune structure. The mana required to craft, it would burn through the metal, making the pathways unusable. Even if a runesmith inscribed them, a weapon like that would probably only last once before melting. This was also a reason why he decided to go with lesser runes for now. He used tongs to slowly heat up the metal before placing it back onto the anvil. He grasped one of the hammers and infused his mana into it. He then started slowly hammering the magical weapon. With each hit, parts of the runic inscriptions were reconstructed back into their previous shape. Before going to the other paddle, he looked at the blacksmith's hammer that he was using. There was a frown on his face, as this item was also wearing down really fast. Rune smithing worked by forcing mana into the smith's hammer. This would slowly damage the integrity of the tool, and with time the metal would start crumbling. The hammer he was using was a new one that he created himself. Making your own smithing tools was good training, but the products that he was making were barely passable. This was a lot harder than scribing that mostly only required good mana control. His high dexterity aided him slightly with the creation process, but his low strength was holding him back. He ran out of stamina fast, and his hands began shaking if he hammered for too long. Just like now, his stamina was drained, but he managed to repair his magical weapon. Luckily, stamina recovered a lot faster than mana did, so after 5 or 10 minutes, he was ready to go. The clinging sounds continued into the night, and Roland had to speed this up as his neighbors would come complaining again if he continued for much longer. While the youth was working on his weapons and items, the rest of the city was silent. After dark, most of the people were either drinking in a tavern or back home resting. There was another type of person out now, though, the type that a regular citizen feared to cross paths with. They were all wearing cloth armor, along with some hardened leather here and there. Their faces were covered by hoods, and they had masks hiding their mouths. Everyone here had the class of thief, and could move silently in the night. They moved quietly while evading the guards that weren't really paying that much attention to their tasks. The city was large, and there weren't that many soldiers. The city lord mostly used his men to protect the richer districts. This left places like Southtown unprotected. This district was where the lower-income commoners lived, and also where the city slums were. Most city guards didn't wander here much, unless they got ordered by the higher-ups. These 4 men were slowly making their way there. They were members of the Thieves' Guild. This was a hidden organization that most of the larger cities had. The people that were members of it took on jobs that the Adventurers Guild deemed unethical or just too dangerous. Some members were even adventurers themselves, working in both guilds at the same time. There were various requirements for getting into this guild, but one of the main ones was having a thievery-related class. This was either a thief or a bandit class, which showed the guild masters that you were one of them. They arrived just in time to hear Roland hammering on some metal. It was about 9 p.m. at night. The 4 spread out to examine the warehouse while keeping themselves hidden. They had to see all the entrance and escape points that this old building had before deciding on the course of action. After they were finished, they moved back into the shadows to discuss further actions. Large door at the front, locked from the inside. Probably won't just go down easy. Windows behind are closed, but just wood and flimsy locks. One door leading probably into the office or bedroom of whoever is living here. The thieves started formulating a plan. They could either burst through the front door and destroy the whole place or sneak in. They decided on the latter. The windows that were at the back of this warehouse looked the easiest. They could just climb through them, and then slit the throat of whoever lived here. We will wait for the target to go to sleep. Remember what the job said. The thieves nodded while slowly moving to their own hiding places. The request stated that they should take whatever the person on the inside was working on. They would receive a bonus if they brought something worthwhile. After ransacking the warehouse, they were planning on burning the place with the owner's body inside. They just needed to wait until he went to bed. With time, the hitting of metal against metal stopped, and the chimney that was connected to the furnace went out. They could see movement on the inside, and after a few hours of waiting, the person on the inside finally went to bed at 12 a.m. The thieves were slightly angry that it took him so long. This was quite late for this world's standards. They waited another 30 or so minutes before deciding to strike. 2 people stayed outside to keep watch, and would alert their companions if something happened. The other 2 sneaked around to the back of the warehouse. Each one of them decided to use a different window to sneak in. They would not use any of the windows that placed them directly in Roland's living quarters. Possibility of him waking up was too high if they tried that. The windows were wooden and thick, and the glass was matte. The locks were simple hook latches that could be easily opened by these thieves from the outside. They just needed to insert something thin between them to lift the lock up before climbing inside. This appeared to be quite the easy job for the burglars. The owner was supposedly just a 13-year-old brat. Such a young person couldn't be high-leveled either, so even if he woke up, they would easily overpower him. The man slowly opened up the windows and climbed into the building. He found himself on a narrow catwalk that was above the main storage area. The wood was old, but thanks to his advanced sneaking skill, he wasn't making a sound. The other thief managed to make it on the inside as well, and the 2 met up. They could see iron tools and items everywhere, but they were all crude and unusable to them. They thought that maybe there would be something worth stealing, but the craftsman on the inside was apparently a newbie. They nodded to themselves and moved towards the smaller living space together. The man in charge of this small band of thieves was here. He gave his party member a sign indicating that he should go in first. The man just nodded and went towards the room that their target was staying at. The door wasn't locked, so he just grabbed the handle and gently opened it up. The thieving skills that they had somehow made things like doors and windows produce less sound while their sneaking was activated. On the inside, they spotted a bed and what looked like to be a sleeping person. The thief that was in the front took out a dagger that had a slight curve to it. The leader just waited by the door in case somehow his companion didn't land a killing blow and the target tried fleeing. He didn't feel like that would be the case, as the person was already in striking distance. The burglar didn't hesitate at all. His dagger moved down and embedded itself in the target's body. The moment it did, the thief felt that something was off. He quickly pulled the bed sheets to the side to discover a bunch of pillows tied together in the form of a human body. There was another thing out of place, a strange-looking piece of paper that was glowing red. Before the hired thug could react to it, though, an explosion occurred. He was hit by a wave of heated energy and tossed like a rag doll against the wall. The thief leader that was watching everything play out quickly ducked back inside the warehouse to evade the rest of the blast. He didn't know what was happening. How could an explosion have occurred? Before he could think about the reason, he felt something. His body jerked to the side, but he wasn't fast enough, as he felt something going through his shoulder. He heard someone clicking their tongue behind him. He wanted to turn around and retaliate, but before he could do that, his whole shoulder exploded. The man grasped the gushing wound. His body had suffered a crippling blow, and he was going into shock. From the shadows, he saw someone walk out. It was a young man with a heavy rapier in his hand. His blood was running down the tip that was slightly glowing red. The man didn't want to believe this. How could a Tier 2 rogue not have noticed someone behind him? This didn't make any sense. He was losing a lot of blood, and he decided to make a run for it. The room in which the explosion happened also had a window, so with much pain he stood up and took off. He covered his head with his good arm as he charged. The window was closed, but he knew that he could force his way through it while not suffering too much damage. He needed to get outside to where his two other companions were. With their help, he could probably make a getaway or even kill this brat. Things wouldn't be going his way, though. As the moment he jumped, he felt something moving behind him. He was already jumping through the window at this moment, so evading the attack from behind was difficult. It was even more difficult, as it was a very fast-traveling Gale arrow that could reach astonishing speeds. It went through his chest while he was jumping out and bending his body to the side in hopes of evading. With the added momentum, the rogue's body traveled even further than he expected. His body smacked into the hard pavement. One of the thieves that was waiting outside arrived to watch the spectacle. He was shocked. Their team leader was a Tier 2 class holder. He was even over level 60, and now he was a mangled mess on the ground. Even without checking, he knew that he was dead. There was a decision to be made. He did what any thief in this situation would do and abandoned this mission. The second lookout had the same idea after seeing their dead leader. On the inside of the warehouse was Roland. He was sweating and his heart was pounding furiously. The person that had received the blast from his rune was still in his workshop. He wasn't dead quite yet, so Roland decided to incapacitate him. Not killing him would probably be the better option, as he might get some answers. He also saw some movement outside. The other thieves luckily decided to flee, and the explosion was loud enough so the guards would be coming. He sat down on one of the wooden chairs while calming down. He had made some preparations for a thing like this. He knew that this was a dangerous neighborhood he was living in. He didn't expect to be part of a home invasion so soon, though. Roland had other spells besides the attacking ones. After noticing that he was really bad at detecting danger, he asked the manager to help him find an item with such a spell. He had acquired a Detect Life spell. It allowed him to see life signatures outside his house, and he used it every day before going to bed. He always went to bed late, which allowed him to notice the burglars that were staking out this warehouse. The other spell that he used was a Shadow Veil spell. This was a common grade spell that allowed him to fade into the shadows. As long as he stayed in them, he was practically invisible. Only a person with high perception could see him, which would have to be at least a Tier 2 advanced scout. After the explosion, he plunged his enchanted rapier into the man's shoulder. He was aiming for the head, but the Tier 2 rogue was fast to react. He was lucky enough that his weapon had this function. He activated it instantly to produce the internal explosion. The rest was history. Was this just a normal robbery or something else? He thought to himself. This felt a bit excessive for a simple thief attack. Did they really have to kill him? They managed to sneak into the building, and they didn't even search it. He watched them move towards his room almost instantly. They were clearly trying to kill him first before doing anything else. Soon enough, more people arrived. The explosion caused quite the commotion, so word of this event would be spreading through the city. The Thieves' Guild would also look into this, as they lost one of their rogues in what seemed to be an easy mission. The seemingly peaceful city wasn't looking that safe anymore. Chapter 39. Into the Sewers. There was quite a commotion in Southtown. In the middle of the night, a loud explosion was heard from one of the warehouses. It was loud enough to wake up the people living there. The guards arrived at the scene quite late as always. They were expecting to find some kind of unregistered alchemist lab accident, but instead, they were greeted by a dead burglar's body. Next to this body was a youth dressed in a dark robe. There was also a tied-up person on the ground in front of the warehouse. One of the windows was missing and smoke was coming out of it. It looked like someone tried jumping through it outside. The guards could see that the two people on the ground had the usual rogue aesthetic. The one that was alive was tied up really well and had a rag shoved into his burned mouth. He was also not looking too good. One of his arms was mangled up. The clothes he was wearing were also ripped apart and also burnt, as if he was getting roasted on a fire. "Took you long enough, these two tried robbing me." The youth moved his hood down from his head and spoke out. He had dark hair and somewhat gloomy expressions. The two guards that got here first looked at each other and then at the supposed thieves. "We'll need you to come with us and explain everything. It was about 2 a.m. at night, and some other people had also gathered here. This world didn't have something like a police station. Instead, it was the city guards that were responsible for the order. Even though Roland was the person that was almost killed, there was no evidence for it yet. They needed to take him back to the guard post and question him along with the witnesses." Roland gave out a sigh. He was already tired and now he needed to go with these two idiots. He didn't want to get in trouble, so he just nodded. Going against the city guards was considered a felony. It was better to get this over with. From the looks of things, he would be spending the night in the brig, as he didn't think they would really question him at this late hour. The whole questioning process was carried out by higher officials, but these two were just common guards. While Roland was mumbling profanities under his nose, someone else arrived at the scene of the crime. This person remained unnoticed while keeping to the shadows. The guards couldn't even see as the person sneaked into the building. The intruder blended into the shadows, as if they were a part of it. There was no one else inside. The figure of the person emerged from the shadows. It looked like a cloud of pitch black smoke. The smoke took shape into the figure of a woman. The woman was wearing black cloth armor that covered all of her body that was quite curvaceous. She was standing in the room where everything happened. The blood was still fresh. She could tell that someone used a similar skill that she performed just now. She could feel the darkness element in the air which piqued her interest. Did the boy use one of his scrolls? Her face was covered by a mask. She had a similar roguish look as the attackers had. The only thing that could be seen under her hood were her bright silver eyes. She started quickly going through the warehouse. With her enhanced skills, she could tell through where the thieves came inside. She could also tell more or less that the thieves were caught off guard. The woman faded back into the shadows and left soon afterward. While traveling through the night, her stats were enhanced, which let her reach her destination fast. The place she was going towards was the richest district in this town called Hightown. From the outside, this building looked very elegant. It was built with gray stones and had yellow pine wood decorations. Tall, large windows allowed enough light to enter the home and had been added to the house in a very symmetric way. The building had a rounded shape and a small garden outside of it. The roof was high, triangular, and was covered with brown roof tiles. One small chimney sat at the side of the house, and some smoke was coming out from it. One of the windows was slightly opened, and a dim light was coming out from it. The woman, with the use of her shadow traveling ability, made her way inside. The moment she entered, she could see a shadow bouncing off from that light. It was a figure of a person. This person was sitting at a desk and looking through some parchments. "Ziliana, is that you? Told you not to sneak up on me like that. You can use the door like a normal person." The voice of the gnome that Roland worked sounded in the residence. The woman's form emerged from the shadows as she made herself noticeable. She looked slightly different from what she normally did. Her golden hair was now pure white and her skin color was dark brown. This was the usual appearance that a moon elf possessed. "But it's more fun this way, Tilda," she giggled while the manager stopped writing. He fixed his glasses and pushed the stack of papers to the side before asking, "Did you find anything?" He was curious, as his assistant rarely returned in the middle of the night without a good reason. Something must have happened. "Perhaps. It's a bit complicated." The gnome's eyebrow rose, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "There was a small incident in Southtown." "In Southtown? We don't really have many assets there." The manager interrupted Ziliana. His store mostly operated in the better parts of the city. He had some real estate bought out in the slums, but only because it was cheap. Its cheapness stemmed from how bad the living conditions there were. "Stop interrupting and let me finish. It's about the kid, you know, your favorite scribe." "Roland? Did something happen? Is he dead?" The gnome rubbed his chin. When this woman was involved, death wasn't far away. It wasn't really far-fetched if the boy got involved with her. "No, not him. Though someone did die by his hands." Ileana started describing the situation. That Roland had slain a Tier 2 thief and captured another one that was close to a high-level steel adventurer. She also gave the info about him using some spells similar to her skills. This part wasn't much of a surprise to the gnome, as Roland had even asked him to supply him with all sorts of spell scrolls. The surprising part was that the child that wasn't even 13 years of age could take out a Tier 2 rogue. "Damn bastards." The gnome smacked the table with his hand. A vein pulsating over his eyebrow was clearly visible. First someone tries to undermine my business and now this. He paused for a moment before turning to his moon elf assistant. Do you know who is responsible? You said that one of the thieves survived. Do you know who they are? Ziliana smirked a bit before answering. They were clearly a party from the guild. That rogue was probably the leader. Haven't been there in a while. Should I pay them a visit? The woman smiled, even wider. This smile made the manager shiver slightly as he knew what she was asking him about. He thought for a moment and nodded. He needed to show that he and his employees couldn't be trifled with. The people from the Thieves' Guild were strong, but he had his own connections, and he wasn't afraid of the consequences. Take Zion with you. If they don't give you the information, you know what to do. What about the kid? The woman asked while turning around and ready to leave. Send someone to pick him up in the morning. The brat will probably chew me out in the morning. No respect for his elders. The woman nodded and left. The manager sighed while thinking about what was going to happen. He knew how this woman operated, but they dared to attack one of his assets that he was cultivating. He knew that Roland had a bright future ahead of him. He was even making enchanted equipment already. He knew that if he managed to strike a deal with him, he would earn a lot of money. Promising runesmiths wasn't something that came across every day. The ones that weren't dwarves were even rarer. He was progressing a lot faster than expected, which made him fear for what the kid would expect in the next contract. This would need to wait as there were more important matters to look into. Mainly the problem with someone trying to sabotage his stores. It started with some bogus claims about faulty products, then some thefts and shipments getting sacked. Now they even tried to kill one of his workers by using the Thieves' Guild's assassins. This had to stop as soon as possible. The guild would need to give up the names of the person responsible or suffer the consequences. The gnome moved from his chair and moved to a different room. It was a round decorative mirror with some crystals around it. The gnome couldn't see his reflection in this mirror, as this was a magic artifact meant for a different purpose. He reached out to one of the crystals and injected some of his mana into it. The moment he did, the crystals started glowing blue. After a few minutes, the glowing crystals changed the color from blue to green. The moment they did, a vague outline of a figure appeared in the mirror. The figure's appearance was blurry at first, but it slowly became sharper. Did something happen? You rarely call. The person that was on the other end of the magical device asked. The manager didn't stall as this magic item burned through magic crystals like nothing. Yes, I need you to pain the gnome that he needed to make this call. He would need to spend some of that hard-earned cash, but it had to be done. The talk continued for a minute. The person on the other side vanished as the conversation ended. This should do it. The old gnome headed back to his room while the night continued. This wasn't yet over, as the main part of the evening had just begun. The elven woman that was in Hightown was already going towards a certain place, where a certain man would probably be. The area that he mostly stayed at was somewhere that she didn't like venturing to. This was the very cutely named Flower District. It didn't really have anything to do with them though. This was the Red Light District, and where all the whorehouses were. They were owned by one of the members from the council. Ziliana appeared at one of the brothels that her co-worker frequented, and was lucky enough to find him. As always, he was naked with two ladies from different races around his neck. She barged into the room while they were already doing the deed, to the brothel owner's dismay. The Moon Elf woman was well known in these parts, so they didn't stop her. The moment the man saw her enter, he greeted her with a smile. Welcome, did you finally change your mind? The man named Zion asked, while not doing much to cover his nether regions. He even sensually pointed his spear towards the dark-skinned elven woman that just furrowed her brows. Get dressed, we have a job to do. I'll wait outside, you have 1 minute. She wasn't in the mood to argue with this guy, as he would just tease her as always. She didn't like working with him, but she knew that his skill was comparable to her own. Back on the outside, Zion finally showed up. His shirt was unbuttoned, and you could see some lipstick marks over his toned body. The man had a similar appearance to Ziliana, as he was also a moon elf. Just like her, he had long silver hair and dark skin. Some people sometimes mistook them for siblings. Lady, did I keep you waiting? He did a courteous bow while sniggering to himself. The man was slightly above 180 cm in height, and had a slimmer toned build. He was also a moon elf with silver hair and brownish skin, but it was slightly lighter than Ziliana's. His eyes were golden in contrast to the female's silver ones. We have work, we are going to pay the guild a visit, so get dressed and take this seriously. She narrowed her eyes at the man who didn't have his battle gear on. Zion nodded and his smile changed into a frown. There was time for pleasure, but now it was the time for work. Bold as always. Give me a minute. The two walked away from the brothel and moved towards one of the dark alleys. Just as the man's figure turned blacker as it faded into the shadows. Soon the two were running next to each other. Zion's face was now covered by a hood and a lower mask. His gear was similar to his female companions. His armor looked to be some kind of black leather. Some intricate inscriptions were visible and indicated that this was enchanted armor of the runic kind. His weapons of choice were two long curved short swords that he held in his hands. The two continued towards their destination at high speeds. The place they were going towards wasn't in any of the districts in the city. No, it was located beneath it, somewhere where normal residents wouldn't even want to venture to. I hate going to the Rat Plaza. It always smells like shit there, the man complained while looking at the entrance to the so-called plaza. It was a large sewer opening that would take them to the city sewers. The sewers were composed of a large array of corridors filled with various waste products. They weren't going there for the rats and bad smell though. There was another place that you could only access through these passages. The two dove inside and could quickly make their way through the dark corridors thanks to their shadow walking skills. They followed the usual path and ended up at a certain wall. If someone didn't know any better, he would think that this was just your everyday piece of rock. The two on the other hand knew what they needed to do. Will the beautiful lady do the honors? Zirian smiled while grinning. The elven woman just rolled her eyes and squatted down. She moved her hand into the sewage water and after a moment managed to find the lever. The moment she shifted it, the wall started moving. The mechanism was slow, and it made the whole wall go in a circle. One day, I'll kill the bastard that placed that damn lever in a spot like that. Ziliana pulled out a bottle of water from her storage bag and started rinsing her hand with it. The two then stepped through the now opened-up passage. The slow-moving wall didn't stop until it was sealed. On the other side, they were greeted by another corridor, this time with magical torches leading the way. They could already hear some people talking inside, as they had arrived in the hidden part of the city of Edelgard. This was the place where all the thieves and bandits spent their time. Some of them even lived here while rarely coming outside. The thieves' guild that they were going after was also here. The two walked inside. Past the torch-lit corridor was a large open space. There were various merchant stands here. The people here weren't selling food though. This was what most people would call a black market. Various stolen items were placed on display. People could even get body parts of humans and monsters that were forbidden for various reasons. The two walked past those merchants. Everyone was covering their faces in one way or another. The whole Rat Plaza spread through the city's underground like a spiderweb. There were various larger junctions and pockets like this black market. Those larger areas were occupied by separate shady organizations. Ones dealt in slaves, others in assassinations, and then there was the Thieves' Guild. It operated in a similar way to the Adventurers' Guild and also had other branches in different cities. It was a group that wasn't very tightly knit like the Adventurers though. Fights for the guildmaster position broke out occasionally. The guilds from other cities wouldn't really get involved with each other unless the payment was good. This also meant that they wouldn't help other guilds retaliate if something happened, unless someone made it worthwhile. This was also why these two elves were quite confident in the task that was given to them. They vanished from the large underground space into one of the many underground corridors. Their destination, the zone where the guild had their headquarters, it was time to get blood on their hands. Chapter 40, Thieves' Guild. Edelgard's Thieves' Guild. It was hidden underground along with all the other unconventional businesses. The only way of reaching it was having a thievery-related class. This was mostly considered to be either a thief class or a bandit class. The first one was your usual pickpocket and someone primed for stealthy operations. The second one was more of a thug, closer to a warrior in stat distribution. The only difference was mostly in some passives while fighting in a less honorable way. The way you achieved it was by stealing, robbing, or even killing other human beings. Just like the Adventurers Guild, it had a notice board where the guild members could take on tasks. They ranged from your typical fetch quests where someone petitioned a certain item from someone's house be taken, all the way to assassination missions and even brutal robberies with no witnesses. Some thief guilds outright forbade missions like those, leaving it up to other more dark organizations like the assassination guilds. This depended on the guild leader, and the one in Edelgard had no problem with getting his guild members' hands bloody. The man running the show here was called Reinald the Razor. This was mostly due to his fondness of cutting up his target's throat with his daggers. He was a high-level person that had taken over the job just a few years ago after the previous guild leader died during one of the job runs. He was the one that brought in some changes to the guild that refrained from the more bloody deeds. The guild now was considered weaker than it was while the old guildmaster was around, mostly due to the fact that the previous one was a high-level tier 3 and an owner of a prestige class. His replacement was just a regular Master Blade rogue without any strong skills in particular. Still, he was the strongest person here, and no one could go against his daggers. The night was slowly winding down, and some of the guild members were returning after carrying out some missions. This brought in a small commotion, as the party that had tried to ransack Roland's workshop had returned with two of their members missing. News soon started spreading about the encounter, and that one of the more experienced members was killed. Hey, did you hear? That old idiot Rawson got himself killed. What? But he was a tier 2. Did he try to fuck the Count's wife or something? One of the talking thieves laughed while the other took things a bit more seriously. It's even worse, they even caught that idiot Brian. I bet old Reinald will skin the rest of their party alive. The thieves knew that getting caught was close to a death sentence. Either you got hung at the gallows by the city guards, or if you gave out any information implicating the guild, you'd have to worry about them chasing you down. Anyone betraying the guild would be marked for death depending on the guild master. The one that was here liked to put out hits on people like handing out cookies. Maybe he will be in a good mood today. We have been getting a lot of work for the past few months. The guild had been busy lately, someone was spending big time, and they were carrying out various tasks. A party of adventurers would mostly win against one composed of thieves and thugs. That was only in an outright brawl. The Thieves Guild members never played fair, always waiting for the right time to strike. They played dirty using poison and only attacked at night. Some of them even used monster attacks as cover. There had been a couple of blunders through this period, but the people outside couldn't really distinguish between a guild member and a regular person. No one would talk about it out of fear of retaliation either. The event that happened today was quite a problem, as an assassination attempt was considered a big deal. The two thieves that returned here, after escaping out of fear, were now getting questioned by the guild master. They were now kneeling down in a dim-lit room. The guild master was sitting behind his desk while playing around with a sharp crimson knife. The two men had their hoods down, and their faces were clearly revealed. They both were regular humans, as the party was very uniform in their race. They weren't alone in this room with only the guild master. There were 4 other people here. 2 were beast men from an undisclosed feline tribe. Another one was a halfling that was leaning up against a wall and skillfully playing around with some throwing knives. 4th one was quite large, and his skin was pale green. He didn't have the look of a rogue and clearly followed more of the bandit route with his class. He belonged to the half-orc race. So you are trying to tell me that that idiot got killed by some brat blacksmith? The 2 nodded in panic, as they didn't hide any details from the operation. They were sure to not leave out any details. The only problem was that they didn't really see what really happened, as they were the lookouts. None of them expected their experienced leader to be killed by an underage blacksmith. They even knew that he was only a steel adventurer. How could he go against a tier 2 rogue at night? Did that idiot step into some magic trap? The guild master had a hard time believing this report. The man that died wasn't much, but he still was a tier 2 class holder. He smelled a conspiracy. Did someone snitch? These 2 escaped the moment their leader's dead body shot out from the window, impaled on the gale arrow. Reinald didn't think that these 2 were lying. The spell that did their party leader in was apparently a green arrow. This he could clearly identify as something a higher mage could use, but a magic scroll could also have been used. He had no reason to not believe these 2, so they were allowed to leave. They didn't do anything wrong, and the guild master thought that someone must have given out information. When they found the one responsible, they would pay dearly. Someone go to the guardhouse, either buy out that idiot or silence him for good. This has to be done tonight. The one listening was the halfling that nodded and left right after the 2 other thieves. Some of the guards in the city were on their payroll, so they could try paying for their guild members' freedom. This would be something that the man would have to pay off with interest. If they failed, they would need to get him removed before he could reveal the guild's hiding place. None of the thieves would actually speak out on their own volition, but there were certain skills that forced people to talk. There were special inquisitor classes that could force people to speak the truth. There were also special magic spells, or even potions, that could be used instead. This was a hit related to the Council of Merchants and Business Owners. They had enough money to order a specialized potion, or even hire a mage. One more thing. The guild master spoke out while the halfling and one of the beastmen was ready to go and carry out the mission. That blacksmith brat that was involved, kill him, no loose ends. He needed to silence both sides. The person from his camp could live if he was set free, but this unknown person needed to die. They also already accepted the mission by the customer, and needed to carry out the request. Otherwise, they would just have their good name tarnished. The 2 people nodded while smirking, but before they even left the room, a certain thing happened. They too were already tier 2, and even close to level 100, but even they couldn't react in time. The magic candlelight flickered for just a moment, and the guild master could slightly see the shadows expanding. He was the only one in the room that saw what was happening. A shadowy hand reached out as his 2 guild members were walking out. The hand looked like it wasn't part of this plane of existence. It looked like it was composed of black smoke as it flickered in the candlelight. The shade hand was holding a very real-looking dagger. It probably felt more real when it was pushed into the catman's back. The halfling was a bit luckier, as thanks to his small stature, he was hard to hit. He rolled to the side after seeing a pointed tip going through one of his guild buddies. He quickly tried flinging his throwing knives at the shadowy hand, but before he could, he felt something piercing him from behind. The 2 men were dead in a flash, and no one could even react. The assailants soon revealed themselves while all dressed up in black leather. Reinald the Razor? More like the idiot. Your greed will be your downfall. A woman's voice came out from under the hood. The person that had backstabbed the halfling sunk back into the shadows ready to strike. The other 2 guards that were in the room stepped forward. The half-orc was huge and had a giant mace in his hand. The other man a regular long sword. Who are you? What do you want? Reinald's eyes went red as he took out his enchanted set of daggers, and was ready for a fight. From the display of power he knew that this woman wasn't someone that he should take lightly. She also wasn't alone. He could feel someone else moving through the shadows. The dim candlelight was working against him. Ciliana and Zirian had snuck in thanks to their shadow-bending skills during the conversation and were just waiting to strike. The Thieves' Guild was something they had visited before and even taken some missions before this man was the guild leader. It was easy to evade detection thanks to their previous knowledge and advanced hiding skills that were rarely seen. What do we want? For starters, you could tell us who ordered you to attack that warehouse in Southtown tonight. The guild master and his goon remained in place while talking to the woman. Reinald caught on fast and realized why this person was here and also who they were working for. You really want to start a fight with the guild over something like this? Does that gnome have a death wish? Even though Reinald was considered a bloodthirsty brute, he was a lot more intelligent than people gave him credit. He knew what that team of 4 had done today, and by who they were hired. He also knew who the warehouse belonged to. It was one of Ixior's assets. Thus he came to the conclusion that the gnome had to be the one sending these people here. The other option would be a third party. Do you? You don't even know how big our company is. It wouldn't be hard to make your little guild disappear. The woman approached with her weapons drawn. Apparently, the threat didn't work. The woman didn't even try to keep her boss' identity secret. It looked as if they were comfortable in starting a war with the Thieves' Guild over this matter. Reinald wasn't someone that used the diplomatic way to get things done. Still, he wasn't sure that he would get out of this alive if he fought now. His 2 bodyguards were weaker than him, and this woman was close to him in levels. The problem was that she wasn't alone, and he knew that they were the types that could kill him before any reinforcements came. Wait. He moved his hand out, and the woman stopped. He didn't want to risk his life against this person. They were clearly seasoned killers. There was a small problem though. He had signed a magical contract similar to the one Roland signed when he was hired. The curse that the Thief Guild Master would receive was quite more deadly than a small mana penalty though. You know how it works. I can't say anything. I'd as well just kill myself right now. But the man's eyes trailed to a painting on the wall that was to the side. This gave the woman assassin enough info for the next step. She walked over and moved the painting to the side. Underneath was a medium-sized safe with a combination lock. 8,752,003,109,567, he said the combination, while still looking at the shadows. His 2 guards were surprised that their leader didn't give him the order to attack yet. Their buddies were dead, but the woman responsible was now going towards his personal safe. Before she put in the code, she turned to face the cat man. You enter the combination. She didn't trust the guild master. Some of these safes were magical. A wrong combination could very well make the thing explode or fire off some poison mist instead. They were the ones with the upper hand, as the thieves were below their skills. Reinald just gave out a sigh and nodded to his henchman. The right code is 8,752,309,569. Hey, don't blame me for trying. He shrugged while glad that the woman didn't react in anger, and just let this slide. The beastman managed to open up the safe without it blowing up in his face or destroying any evidence. She also realized why he wouldn't really be willing to blow it up, as there were a lot of gold coins and costly documents inside. After going through them, she found a certain black book with the names of customers. With more digging, she found what she was looking for. The Thieves' Guild kept a record of everyone they were working with and for. They did it mostly to have evidence to blackmail anyone that had a change of mind and snitched. This isn't good. She looked at the name of the person that ordered the hit. The name was also visible on other missions like the ones that used poison in the restaurants or the ones that targeted the caravans of other council members. Reinald couldn't disclose the information himself, but if someone found any evidence themselves he wouldn't suffer any consequences. Luckily he managed to have a backdoor in the contract as he was working with people that weren't very familiar with how things worked in the shadows. Now you know, not like you'll be able to do much with that knowledge. Now fuck off. Ciliana took a moment to digest the information that she received. It was true. The person responsible would be hard to go against if what the book said was true. If you send any more of your men after our workers, you'll find yourself with a dagger in your back. Ciliana threw the book back at the guild master while giving him a warning. Soon the 2 assassins faded into the shadows to make their escape. The Thief Guild leader roared out in rage and smashed his desk in half with his fist. The 2 intruders wouldn't witness his meltdown as they were busy with retreating. Zirian emerged from the shadows to have a small chat while they were running. That was boring. Wouldn't it have been better to just finish them off? Ciliana looked at her partner in crime like she was looking at an idiot. There was a line that you shouldn't cross. If they assassinated the guild leader, the other guilds might get involved. It was unknown if they would, but they had some powerful individuals on their payroll. It was better to leave them alone, unless it was absolutely necessary. This way the guilds would remain neutral for sure. No, as long as we don't go overboard they won't either. We send a message. They won't be sending any more hits out for a while. The guild master would probably cease any operations for a while as the whole council of merchants will now know who was behind this. Problem was that the real mastermind wasn't someone that regular people could touch. So, who is it? You got awfully quiet after reading those notes. Ziliana stopped in her tracks and looked at the moon elf companion. We should split up here. I need to go do my report and then check up on the kid. I'll call you when I need you. The woman said before vanishing. Zion just shrugged while also disappearing. He didn't really care who it was they were going against. He was only interested in money and pleasure. If it got too tiresome, he could always just ditch and find someone else to give him money. There were many rich people in this world happy to hire someone with his unique set of skills. The night was finally coming to an end. The ending wasn't as bloody as expected, as Ziliana handled it with only 2 people getting killed. She sped towards the manager's house to do her report. The person that was entangled in this whole mess was leaning up against a cold stone wall. He was cold and couldn't sleep. The guards had pushed him inside one of the prison cells like a common criminal. He was awaiting someone that would be here at 8 a.m. He hoped that he could explain himself and go back to his workshop. He needed to also contact his boss, as he had a sinking suspicion that the company that he was working for was the real target of this attack and not he. He would still need to wait a few hours as it was only 4 in the morning. There were a myriad of thoughts going through his head, mostly about how he could prepare his workshop against forced entry in the future. He felt like he could have done better, but it wasn't a total disaster. He managed to get away without an injury and slew a Tier 2 burglar. He had also gained a title that he would rather not have, namely the Manslayer. This was something you got after killing a human being. He took part in slaying the fencer that was after him that one time, but he wasn't the one that performed the last hit. He wasn't sure if it was because of him already having killed so many humanoid monsters like goblins that he wasn't feeling bad about it. Did he get used to killing already? After thinking about new contingencies and what went wrong, he finally managed to get tired enough to doze off. What transpired in the shadows would remain unknown to him for some time.